There's a place where the earth remembers what humanity has chosen to forget. In the lowlands of southern Mexico, where the states of Veracruz and Tabasco meet the warm waters of the Gulf, a landscape exists that seems designed to swallow secrets. Rivers snake through dense tropical forest, their brown waters heavy with sediment carried down from distant mountains. The air hangs thick with moisture, and the ground itself seems uncertain, shifting between solid earth and swamp, depending on the season and the whims of rainfall. This is not a landscape that invites permanence. It devours, it reclaims. And yet, 3,000 years ago, someone looked upon this challenging terrain and saw possibility. Someone gathered communities together, organized labor on a scale previously unknown in the Americas, and built a civilization that would echo through millennia. They carved portraits in stone so massive that later generations would struggle to believe human hands had made them. They developed systems of thought, of art, of spiritual understanding that would shape every culture to follow in this vast region. The Maya would inherit their calendar. The Aztecs would worship gods whose forms first emerged from their imaginations. Every ball court, every stepped pyramid, every jade mask crafted in Mesoamerica for the next 2,000 years would carry their influence. We called them the Olmec, though this is not a name they would have recognized. The word comes from the Aztec language, Nahuatl, and means something like rubber people, a reference to the rubber trees that grow abundantly in their homeland. The Aztecs used this term for the peoples living in that region in their own time. More than 2,000 years after the original Olmec civilization had faded into the jungle, when European scholars needed a name for the ancient culture, they were slowly piecing together from scattered monuments and buried offerings. They borrowed this Aztec term. It stuck, despite being an anachronism, a label applied by strangers to a people who left no record of what they called themselves. The story of how we came to know the Olmec at all begins with accidents and curiosities, with farmers turning up strange objects in their fields and travelers stumbling upon monuments half swallowed by forest. For centuries, these discoveries remained isolated incidents, local wonders that never coalesced into a broader understanding. The jungle kept its secrets well, and the outside world had little reason to look closely at the swamps of southern Mexico. Everything changed in 1862, when a farm worker clearing land in the Huyupan region of Veracruz struck something hard beneath the soil. At first, he likely assumed it was simply a large stone, the kind that farmers throughout the region regularly encountered and worked around. But as more earth fell away, an unmistakable shape emerged. It was a face. A massive human face carved from a single block of dark stone, staring up from the ground with an expression that seemed to contain both serenity and power. Jose Maria Melgar y Serrano, a local antiquarian with an interest in the pre-Columbian past, learned of the discovery and made his way to the site. What he found there would puzzle him for years. The head was enormous, measuring roughly 5 feet in height and proportionally wide, depicting a figure wearing what appeared to be a tight-fitting helmet or cap. The features were striking, the lips full, the nose broad and flat, the eyes appearing almost closed or deeply hooded. The craftsmanship was undeniable. Someone had shaped this boulder with extraordinary skill, creating a portrait that radiated dignity and authority despite having spent unknown centuries buried in the earth. Akara documented the find and eventually published his observations, but his conclusions reflected the limited knowledge of his time. He speculated that the features of the face suggested African origins, proposing that perhaps ancient peoples from across the Atlantic had somehow made their way to Mexico. This theory would persist in various forms for decades, a testament to how completely the actual creators of these monuments had been forgotten. Without any framework for understanding what he had found, Melgar reached for connections that made sense to a 19th century mind steeped in old world histories. The idea that an indigenous American civilization arising independently could have achieved such monumental artistry was simply not part of his conceptual vocabulary. The Tres-Zapote's head, as this discovery came to be known, did not immediately revolutionize understanding of ancient Mexico. It remained a curiosity discussed in scholarly circles, but not integrated into any comprehensive picture of pre-Columbian civilization. Other objects surfaced over the following decades: jade figurines and carved stone implements that hinted at a sophisticated ancient culture, but these too remained fragments without a frame. The landscape itself resisted investigation. The region where these artifacts appeared was not easily accessible. Roads were poor or non-existent. The climate was punishing, with oppressive heat and humidity that sapped the strength of visitors accustomed to temperate conditions. Insects carried diseases that could prove fatal, and the terrain offered few obvious targets for excavation. Unlike the dramatic pyramids of the Maya or the imposing ruins of Teotihuacan in the central highlands, the Olmec Heartland presented no visible monuments rising above the forest canopy. Whatever structures they had built, time and vegetation had claimed them, leaving only mounds that could easily be mistaken for natural features of the landscape. The early 20th century brought renewed interest in the pre-Columbian past, driven partly by the Mexican Revolution and its aftermath. The new nation that emerged from those tumultuous years sought to define itself, and part of that definition involved looking backward, claiming the achievements of ancient civilizations as part of a distinctly Mexican heritage. Scholars and archaeologists received government support to investigate sites throughout the country, mapping and excavating the remnants of cultures that had flourished before European contact. It was in this context that the Olmec Heartland finally began to yield its secrets in earnest. The 1920s and 1930s saw a series of discoveries that would transform everything researchers thought they knew about the sequence of civilizations in ancient Mesoamerica. What had been dismissed as a provincial backwater, a swampy region of little historical significance, revealed itself to be the wellspring from which much of Mesoamerican culture had flowed. The key figure in this revelation was Matthew Stirling, an American archaeologist working for the Smithsonian Institution. Stirling had become fascinated by reports of massive stone sculptures emerging from the Gulf Coast lowlands, and he organized a series of expeditions to investigate. Beginning in 1938, he and his team worked their way through some of the most challenging terrain in Mexico, guided by local informants to sites where ancient monuments lay hidden beneath centuries of accumulated vegetation and soil. What Stirling found exceeded anything he had imagined. At Venta, an island of solid ground rising from the surrounding swamps, he uncovered an entire ceremonial complex, complete with pyramid mounds, elaborate tombs, and buried offerings of exquisite jade objects. The site had been a center of considerable importance, a place where rulers were buried with treasures and where rituals of great significance had been performed. But the dating of these finds presented a puzzle. Based on the artistic styles and the stratigraphic evidence, Venta appeared to be older than the Maya cities that had long been considered the earliest high civilizations of Mesoamerica. At San Lorenzo, another site in the region, Stirling made discoveries that were even more dramatic. Here, on a plateau that rose above the surrounding floodplains, he found not one, but multiple colossal heads, similar in style to the Tres-Zapote's head that Melgar had documented nearly 80 years earlier. These were clearly not isolated creations, but products of a consistent artistic tradition, portraits of individuals rendered in a recognizable style with specific conventions. The sheer effort required to create them, to quarry massive boulders from distant mountains and transport them across rivers and through swamps, spoke to a level of social organization that demanded explanation. The local people who lived near these sites had their own traditions about the stone heads. Some called them the Old Ones, or referred to them as the heads of giants who had once walked the earth. Others associated them with supernatural beings or with ancestors of great power. These folk memories preserved a thread of connection to the ancient past, even if the specific knowledge of who had made the heads and why had been lost long ago. Stirling and his colleagues worked to reconstruct the history that these monuments represented. They mapped sites, cataloged artifacts, and collected samples for the newly developed technique of radiocarbon dating. The results confirmed what the stratigraphy had suggested. The Olmec sites were genuinely ancient, dating back to periods between 1500 and 400 BCE, making them contemporary with, or even older than, many Old World civilizations. While the Greeks were developing philosophy and the Zhou dynasty ruled China, the Olmec were raising monuments in the jungles of Mexico. This chronology had profound implications. If the Olmec were indeed this old, and if the elements of their culture, the artistic motifs, the religious symbols, the architectural forms, could be traced forward into later Mesoamerican civilizations, then the Olmec represented something foundational. They were not simply one culture among many, but potentially the origin point. The mother culture from which the Maya, Zapotec, Aztec, and others had inherited core elements of their worldviews and practices. The concept of a mother culture would prove controversial among scholars, and debates about its accuracy continue to this day. Some argue that the term overstates Olmec influence, that other early cultures developed sophisticated traditions independently. Others maintain that the evidence clearly shows Olmec innovations spreading outward, carried by trade, migration, or cultural transmission to shape the development of civilization throughout the region. What is not disputed is the antiquity and sophistication of the Olmec themselves, or the remarkable achievements they left behind in that unlikely landscape of rivers and swamps. To understand how they accomplished what they did, we must first understand where they did it. The Olmec Heartland occupies a geographic region that seems almost perversely unsuited to civilization as we typically imagine it. There are no easily quarried building stones, no defensible mountain strongholds, no natural harbors opening onto the sea. Instead, there are rivers, endless rivers, branching and rejoining, flooding their banks during the rainy season and subsiding to expose rich alluvial soil when the waters recede. This hydrology proved to be the key. The annual floods deposited nutrients, creating agricultural conditions of extraordinary fertility. Crops planted in this refreshed soil yielded abundantly, capable of supporting populations far larger than the land could otherwise sustain. The rivers also provided transportation routes, natural highways along which people and goods could travel far more easily than overland through dense forest. What appeared to be obstacles were actually advantages for those who learned to work with the rhythm of the waters rather than against them. The Olmec mastered this environment. They developed techniques for managing floodwaters, or timing their plantings to take advantage of receding waters, to building their settlements on the slightly elevated ground that remained dry during all but the most extreme floods. They learned which resources could be found where. Forests yielded the finest woods, which streams held the best fish, which regions offered clay suitable for pottery or stones appropriate for grinding implements, and they learned to see possibilities in stone. Somewhere in the Tuxtla Mountains, perhaps 40 miles or more from the major Olmec centers, outcrops of basalt offered raw material of a quality and hardness suitable for monumental sculpture. Getting multi-ton boulders from these mountains to the lowland sites where they would be carved required vision, organization, and determination on a scale that still inspires wonder. We will explore later how this might have been accomplished. The theories about log rollers and rafts, about labor forces and logistics. But now, it is enough to note that the Olmecs solved this problem, repeatedly creating a body of monumental art unlike anything else in the ancient Americas. The night falls gently over the Gulf Coast lowlands, and, somewhere beneath the soil, the great stone heads continue their patient vigil. They have watched 3,000 years pass, seen empires rise and fall, witnessed the arrival of strangers from across the sea, and the transformation of the land they once dominated. Their closed or hooded eyes reveal nothing, but they endure these portraits of forgotten rulers, testaments to to a civilization that refused to be limited by the challenges of its environment. The jungle has reclaimed much, but not everything. What remains continues to speak to those willing to listen, to those who come seeking to understand how it all began. The Olmec story is a story of firsts. Its first monumental architecture in Mesoamerica, first complex society, first writing, perhaps, though this claim remains debated, first calendar systems, first planned urban centers, first widespread trade networks, carrying goods and ideas across hundreds of miles. To follow this story is to trace the roots of everything that came after, to understand how the template was established that would shape human experience in this part of the world for millennia. It is a story that begins in mud and ends in mystery, passing through achievements that rival any in the ancient world. Come with me now into the swamps and forests of ancient Veracruz and Tabasco. Let us walk the paths the Olmec walked, imagine the world as they saw it, and try to understand what drove them to build what they built and believe what they believed. The journey will take us through ceremonial centers and royal tombs, through workshops where artisans shaped jade and obsidian, through temples where priests interpreted the movements of stars. We will meet the faces of rulers dead 3,000 years, preserved in stone with an intensity that still commands attention. And we will confront the ultimate mystery at the heart of the Olmec story, the question of how so much could emerge from so unlikely a place, and why, after 1,000 years of fluorescence, it all came to an end. The waters of the Coatzacoalcos River continued their journey to the sea, just as they did when the first Olmec settlements took root along their banks. The land remembers, even when people forget. And sometimes, if we are patient and attentive, the land will share what it remembers with those who come asking the right questions. The Olmec left no libraries, no chronicles, no written histories that survived the centuries. But they left their monuments, their jade masks, their buried offerings. They left the imprint of their ideas on every culture that followed. And they left us wondering, across the vast gulf of time, who they were and what they knew that we have yet to rediscover. The telegram arrived at the Smithsonian Institution on a winter morning in 1938, carrying news that would reshape the study of ancient America. Matthew Stirling had found something extraordinary in the swamps of Veracruz, something that demanded immediate attention and resources. The descriptions he sent back spoke of massive carved heads emerging from the earth, of jade treasures buried in elaborate tombs, of a ceremonial complex that dwarfed anything previously documented in the region. The scientific establishment, long focused on the Maya and Aztec civilizations of the highlands and Yucatan, was about to have its assumptions challenged in fundamental ways. Stirling was not the first to recognize that something significant lay hidden in the Gulf Coast lowlands. Franz Blom and Oliver Lafarge had conducted surveys of the region in the 1920s, documenting scattered monuments and collecting oral traditions from local communities. Their work hinted at a sophisticated ancient presence, but the full scope of what they had glimpsed remained unclear. It fell to Stirling, with his methodical approach and institutional backing, to transform those hints into certainty. The expeditions he led between 1938 and 1946 would prove to be among the most consequential in the history of American archaeology. Working in conditions that tested the limits of human endurance, Stirling and his team, which included his wife Marion, herself a skilled photographer whose images would document discoveries for posterity, systematically excavated sites that had lain undisturbed for millennia. They hired local workers who knew the terrain intimately, men who had grown up hearing stories about the stone giants buried in the forest and who could navigate the labyrinth of waterways that connected the scattered islands of high ground. Venta became the first major focus of their efforts. This site occupied a natural island, roughly 2 miles long and a mile wide, rising from the surrounding swamps along the Tanala River. The location seemed unpromising at first glance, isolated and difficult to access, surrounded by wetlands that flooded unpredictably. But as excavations progressed, the strategic genius of the site became apparent. The island provided a defensible position, a place that could be reached only by water, where access could be controlled and monitored. It also offered something precious in the landscape of mud and moisture, solid ground on which to build. And build the Olmec did on a scale that astonished the archaeologists who uncovered their works. At the southern end of the island rose a massive mound, roughly 100 feet high and 400 feet in diameter at its base. This was no natural formation, but an artificial mountain constructed from countless basket loads of earth carried and deposited over generations. Its shape was distinctive, featuring a series of ridges and valleys that gave it an almost organic appearance, like a giant fluted cone rising from the swamp. Some researchers have suggested it was meant to represent a volcano, echoing the sacred mountains visible on the distant horizon. Others see in its form an abstraction of the jaguar, that most potent of Olmec symbols. Whatever its intended meaning, the labor required to build it testified to the organizational capacity of the society that created it. Stretching northward from this great pyramid lay a ceremonial avenue flanked by smaller mounds and platforms. The alignment was deliberate, oriented along a precise north-south axis that spoke to careful planning and astronomical awareness. Buried beneath the plazas and courts that lined this processional way, Stirling's team discovered offerings of astonishing richness, caches of jade objects, some carved into human forms with the distinctive features that would come to define Olmec art, lay where priests had placed him centuries before the Common Era. Massive offerings of serpentine blocks, laboriously transported from sources dozens of miles away, have been arranged in patterns whose meanings we can only guess at before being buried and never intended to be seen again. Tombs were perhaps most striking of all. In one designated tomb A, the remains of 2 juveniles have been laid to rest surrounded by jade figurines, their bodies wrapped in bundles and accompanied by objects of great value. The jade alone represented wealth almost beyond calculation, for this stone held supreme importance in Olmec culture, valued far above gold, which they largely ignored. To bury such treasures with the dead spoke to beliefs about the afterlife, about the need to equip the deceased for journeys or challenges that awaited them beyond death. But it was the colossal heads that captured the imagination most powerfully. At Venta, Stirling found 4 of these monuments, each carved from a single basalt boulder and depicting a human face with striking realism. They ranged in height from 5 to 9 feet, and their weights were measured in tons, sometimes approaching 20 tons for the largest examples. Each face was unique, bearing individual features that suggested these were portraits of specific individuals, rather than generic representations of gods or abstract concepts. The helmets or headdresses they wore varied in design, perhaps indicating different ranks or affiliations, different achievements or lineages. The transportation of these massive stones presented an immediate puzzle. The nearest source of basalt lay in the Tuxtla Mountains, more than 50 miles away as the crow flies, and considerably farther by any practical route. Between the quarries and the Venta stretched a landscape of rivers, swamps, forests, and varying terrain that would challenge modern engineers with modern equipment. Olmec had no metal tools, no wheels, no draft animals. They had only human muscle, human ingenuity, and whatever advantages they could coax from the natural environment. Scholars have proposed various solutions to this transportation problem. The most widely accepted theory involves the use of rivers as natural highways. Boulders could be quarried from mountain outcrops and moved downslope to the nearest navigable waterway, a challenging but achievable task using log rollers, wooden sledges, and the coordinated efforts of many workers. Once waterborne, the stones could be floated on rafts constructed from buoyant woods, guided downstream and then along the coast to rivers that approached the final destination. The last leg of the journey, from riverbank to ceremonial center, would again require overland transport, but over much shorter distances. This theory makes practical sense, but it also raises questions about the scale of organization required. Building rafts capable of carrying 20-ton loads demanded not only skilled craftsmen, but also access to substantial quantities of appropriate timber. Coordinating the movement of such vessels along rivers subject to seasonal flooding and unpredictable currents required knowledge accumulated over generations, and the labor force necessary for these operations, both for the transport itself and for the quarrying, carving, and final installation, applied a population base and social hierarchy capable of mobilizing hundreds, if not thousands of workers for extended periods. The discoveries at Venta established that the Olmec civilization was no minor regional phenomenon. Here was evidence of a complex society with specialized craftsmen, organized religion, ruling elites buried with elaborate grave goods, and the ability to execute monumental construction projects. But questions of chronology remained. How old was this culture, and what was its relationship to other ancient Mesoamerican civilizations? The answers came from San Lorenzo, a site that would prove even older than Venta, and in some ways even more impressive. Located about 40 miles to the southeast, San Lorenzo occupied a plateau that rose dramatically above the surrounding floodplains of the Coast River. This plateau, researchers eventually realized, was not entirely natural. The Olmec had modified it extensively, building up portions with fill, carving out ravines, and shaping the entire landform into a massive artificial platform, roughly 3/4 of a mile long and half a mile wide. The scale of this earthwork defied easy comprehension. Millions of cubic feet of earth had been moved to create this elevated surface, all without metal shovels, without wheeled carts, without any of the technologies that later civilizations would employ for such projects. The workers carried their loads in baskets, one trip at a time, year after year, generation after generation, till the vision of their rulers took physical form above the swamps. On this prepared surface, the San Lorenzo Olmec built their capital. The layout included residential areas, workshop zones where craftsmen produced goods for elite consumption, and ceremonial spaces where rituals reinforced the social order. Drainage systems carried water away from inhabited areas, an engineering solution that addressed one of the fundamental challenges of life in such a wet environment. The sophistication of these systems, with their precisely graded channels and carefully placed stones, suggested generations of experimentation and refinement. And everywhere there were sculptures. San Lorenzo yielded more colossal heads than any other Olmec site, 10 in total, ranging from the most massive examples known to somewhat smaller but equally striking portraits. Unlike the Venta heads, which had been buried in orderly arrangements, the San Lorenzo heads showed signs of deliberate mutilation. Features had been ground off, surfaces defaced, and the monuments themselves had been dragged to ravines at the edge of the plateau and pushed into depressions, where they lay for nearly 3,000 years. This pattern of destruction raised troubling questions. Had the San Lorenzo Olmec turned against their own monuments in some act of iconoclasm, perhaps during a political upheaval or religious transformation? Had invaders sacked the city and desecrated its most sacred images? Or was the burial of these heads somehow intentional, part of a ritual process whose logic escapes us? The evidence permitted multiple interpretations, and scholars continue to debate the meaning of what they find. Radiocarbon dating of organic materials from San Lorenzo provided crucial chronological anchors. The site had been occupied as early as 1500 BCE, making it contemporary with the New Kingdom of Egypt and the Shang dynasty of China. It had flourished as a major center for roughly 6 centuries before experiencing a dramatic decline. Around 900 BCE, Venta's rise corresponded roughly to San Lorenzo's fall, suggesting a possible transfer of power. Perhaps a migration of elites or a conquest that shifted the political center of gravity westward. These dates had revolutionary implications. The Maya civilization long considered the pinnacle of ancient Mesoamerican achievement, had developed its distinctive characteristics during the first millennium of the Common Era, a full 1,000 years or more after San Lorenzo's heyday. The great Maya cities of Tikal and Palenque, with their hieroglyphic inscriptions and astronomical observatories, their elaborate murals and towering temple pyramids, came after the Olmec, not before. If cultural elements could be traced from Maya practice back to Olmec origins, then the Olmec deserved recognition as the foundational civilization of the region, the culture that established patterns all others would follow. This was precisely the argument that began to emerge as scholars analyzed the accumulating evidence. The concept of a mother culture entered the discourse, championed by researchers who saw in Olmec art and architecture the prototypes for later Mesoamerican traditions. The feathered serpent, that most persistent of Mesoamerican symbols, appeared in Olmec iconography centuries before it adorned Maya temples or Aztec shrines. The long count calendar, that remarkable system for tracking vast spans of time that the Maya would use to record their history, seemed to have Olmec roots. Even the sacred ball game, played throughout Mesoamerica for 3,000 years, may have originated in Olmec ceremonial centers. Not all scholars accepted this characterization. Some pointed out that the mother culture concept implied a unidirectional flow of influence from Olmec Heartland outward that might oversimplify a more complex reality. Contemporary cultures in other regions, the Zapotecs of Oaxaca, the peoples of the Valley of Mexico, the inhabitants of the Pacific coast, were developing their own traditions during the same centuries the Olmec flourished. Interactions among these groups were surely multidirectional, with ideas and practices flowing along trade routes in all directions. To credit the Olmec with inventing everything risked diminishing the creativity of other peoples. This debate continues in modified forms today, with most scholars adopting nuanced positions that acknowledge Olmec priority in certain domains while recognizing the contributions of other early cultures. What remains beyond dispute is the sheer precocity of Olmec achievement. By any measure, they created the first complex society in Mesoamerica, the first to build monumental architecture, the first to produce large-scale stone sculpture, the first to develop recognizable writing systems. Whether we call them a mother culture or simply a remarkably precocious early civilization, their influence on everything that followed cannot be denied. The term Olmec itself acquired its modern meaning through this process of discovery and interpretation. As mentioned, the word derives from Nahuatl, the language of the Aztecs, who used it to refer to peoples living in the rubber-producing lowlands of the Gulf Coast during their own era, roughly 2,000 years after the civilization we now call Olmec had ceased to exist. When archaeologists needed a name for the ancient culture they were excavating, they borrowed this term, despite its anachronistic character. The original Olmec, the ancient ones who carved the colossal heads and built the pyramids, would not have recognized the name. What did they call themselves? This question may never be answered. The Olmec developed writing, but our understanding of their script remains limited. So few inscriptions that survive are brief and fragmentary, insufficient to reconstruct a grammar or vocabulary. Names of rulers, names of places, names of gods, all remain locked behind symbols we cannot fully decipher. The Olmecs speak to us through their art, their architecture, their buried offerings, but they do not speak in words we can read. This silence lends them an additional measure of mystery. We can look upon the faces of their rulers, preserved with striking individuality in basalt, but we cannot know their names or their deeds. We can map their ceremonial centers and trace their trade routes, but we cannot read their histories or their myths. They are present and absent simultaneously, vividly real in their material remains, yet utterly silent about themselves. Marion Stirling's photographs preserve the moments of discovery. Images of massive stone faces emerging from the earth as workers carefully remove centuries of accumulated soil. In these photographs, the colossal heads seem almost alive, reef features gaining definition as sunlight reaches them for the first time in millennia. The expressions on the faces of the workers and archaeologists captured the wonder of these encounters. The sense of reaching across vast stretches of time to touch something anciently and inexplicably human. Matthew Stirling himself became the foremost champion of Olmec studies, devoting decades to excavation, analysis, and publication. His work established the foundations upon which all subsequent research would build. The sites he investigated, San Lorenzo, Venta, Tres, Zapotes, remain the most important Olmec centers known, though subsequent discoveries have expanded the map considerably. His interpretations, particularly his insistence on the great antiquity of Olmec culture and its foundational role in Mesoamerican civilization, have been largely vindicated by later research. The Smithsonian expeditions ended after the war, but interest in the Olmec only grew. Mexican archaeologists took up the work, bringing resources and perspectives that enriched understanding of these ancient people. New sites were discovered, new monuments unearthed, new offerings revealed. The picture that emerged was of a civilization more extensive and more sophisticated than early researchers had imagined. It's one that had maintained connections across hundreds of miles and persisted through centuries of development and change. Each discovery raised new questions, even as it answered old ones. The Olmec became simultaneously better known and more mysterious, their achievements more clearly documented, yet their motivations and beliefs more puzzling. Why did they carve those massive heads? What did the buried offerings mean? How did their society function, and why did it eventually collapse? These questions beckoned researchers into the swamps and forests of the Gulf Coast, continuing a journey of discovery that Matthew Stirling had begun on that winter day when his telegram reached Washington with news that would change everything. The mother culture had been found. Now the work of understanding her could truly begin. The rivers told them where to build, its landscape dominated by water, where the distinction between land and liquid blurred with every rainy season. The Olmec learned to read the subtle grammar of hydrology. They understood which banks would flood and which would hold, which channels would remain navigable when waters receded, and which would become impassable mud. This knowledge, accumulated across generations, guided them to places where civilization could take root despite the challenges of the environment. And in those places, they constructed centers of power that would endure for centuries. San Lorenzo stands as the earliest of these great centers, the first true city in Mesoamerica by most scholarly reckonings. Its origins reach back to approximately 1500 BCE, a time when much of the world still organized itself in villages and chiefdoms rather than complex urban societies. By 1200 BCE, San Lorenzo had become the dominant power in the Olmec Heartland, a ceremonial and political capital whose influence extended far beyond its immediate hinterland. For 300 years, it flourished, growing in size and sophistication until its mysterious decline around 900 BCE opened the way for successive sites to claim its mantle. The location chosen for San Lorenzo reveals the strategic thinking of its founders. The site occupies a plateau that rises roughly 150 feet above the surrounding flatplains, providing both defensibility and drainage that made permanent settlement feasible. But the natural plateau was not sufficient for Olmec ambitions. They expanded and reshaped it, adding massive quantities of fill to extend the usable surface and carving the edges into a distinctive pattern of ridges and ravines whose purposes remain debated. Some researchers have suggested that the entire plateau was sculpted to represent a gigantic bird when viewed from above, its wings formed by the extended ridges, its body by the central mass. This interpretation remains controversial, as the evidence is circumstantial and the required aerial perspective would have been unavailable to the ancient builders. Yet the Olmec clearly imposed intentional form on their landscape in ways that went beyond mere practicality. They were not simply building a settlement, but creating a symbolic statement in earth and stone. The engineering required for this transformation staggers the imagination. Conservative estimates suggest that the San Lorenzo Plateau contains roughly 2 million cubic meters of artificial fill, earth, that was carried basket by basket from surrounding areas and deposited according to a master plan that unfolded across decades or centuries. The labor force necessary for such an undertaking implies a population base of considerable size, organized under an authority capable of directing sustained collective effort. This was not the work of independent farmers coming together occasionally for communal projects. This was state-level organization, perhaps the first in the Americas. Atop this prepared surface, the Olmec constructed their capital according to principles that would echo through all subsequent Mesoamerican urbanism. The site was organized along a north-south axis with major structures aligned to cardinal directions. This orientation reflected cosmological beliefs that connected the earthly realm to celestial patterns, anchoring human society within a larger cosmic order. The precision of these alignments, achievable only through careful astronomical observation over extended periods, demonstrates that Olmec intellectual sophistication matched their engineering capabilities. The built environment of San Lorenzo included residential zones where the general population lived in structures of perishable materials, wattle and daub walls beneath thatched roofs that left few traces for archaeologists to study. More durable were the platforms and mounds that supported elite residencies and ceremonial buildings. These earthen constructions, faced with clay and sometimes surfaced with colored pigments, created elevated spaces that physically embodied the social hierarchy. Those who lived and performed rituals on these platforms literally stood above the common population, a superior position made visible in the architecture of the city itself. Workshop areas revealed the economic activities that supported Olmec society. Craftsmen working in designated zones produced the objects that elite patrons demanded. From everyday pottery to the precious jade carvings that have become synonymous with Olmec artistic achievement. The concentration of these workshops near elite residential areas suggests close relationships between rulers, king, and the skilled workers who serve them, perhaps arrangements in which craftsmen receive support and protection in exchange for their specialized labor. Most remarkable among San Lorenzo's features was its drainage system, a network of buried stone conduits that channeled water away from inhabited areas and out to the edges of the plateau. These drains were constructed from carefully shaped basalt blocks, U-shaped troughs fitted together and capped with flat stones to create enclosed channels. The engineering precision required to achieve the necessary gradients for water flow without modern surveying instruments testifies to the Olmec mastery of practical hydraulics. The system served multiple functions. During heavy rains, it prevented flooding of important structures, protecting both the physical buildings and the ritual activities that took place within them. It may also have supplied water to specific locations, perhaps fountains or pools that figured in ceremonial life. Some researchers have proposed that the sounds of water moving through these hidden channels created auditory effects that enhanced the sacred atmosphere of certain spaces. The voice of hidden waters speaking from beneath the earth. Around 900 BCE, San Lorenzo's dominance came to an end. The colossal heads that had commemorated its rulers were defaced and buried in ravines. Major construction ceased. The population declined, though the site was never entirely abandoned. What caused this transformation remains one of the enduring mysteries of Olmec studies. Theories range from internal political collapse to external conquest, from environmental degradation to deliberate ritual termination of the site's sacred status. The pattern of monument destruction provides tantalizing clues without offering definitive answers. The colossal heads were not simply toppled and forgotten, but deliberately mutilated. Their features ground away before they were dragged to their final resting places. This suggests intentional action rather than mere neglect, a desire to neutralize whatever power these images were believed to possess. Whether this was done by San Lorenzo's own people, perhaps during a revolution against the ruling lineage the heads represented, or by outsiders seeking to erase the symbols of a conquered regime, cannot be determined from the archaeological evidence alone. As San Lorenzo declined, Venta rose. Located roughly 50 miles to the northwest, this site will become the new center of Olmec civilization for the next 5 centuries, maintaining and elaborating traditions that had originated at San Lorenzo while developing innovations of its own. The transition between these centers, whether it represented continuity or rupture, peaceful transfer or violent conquest, remains obscured by the passage of time and the limitations of archaeological evidence. Venta occupied a very different setting than its predecessor. Rather than a naturally elevated plateau, the site developed on an island of relatively solid ground within an expanse of coastal swamps. The island measured roughly 2 miles long and a mile wide, large enough for a significant settlement, but modest by the standards of later Mesoamerican cities. What Venta lacked in size, however, it compensated for in the intensity of its sacred architecture. The Great Pyramid that dominated Venta's ceremonial precinct represents a quantum leap in monumental construction, rising approximately 100 feet above the surrounding terrain. This clay mound was the largest structure yet built in Mesoamerica. A visible symbol of power that could be seen from considerable distances across the flat surrounding landscape. Its distinctive shape, featuring a series of ridges and indentations rather than the smooth slopes of later pyramids, has prompted various interpretations. Some see it as an artificial mountain, recreating in the swampy lowlands the volcanic peaks visible on the distant horizon. Others propose it represents a specific sacred mountain from Olmec mythology, an axis mundi connecting earthly and supernatural realms. The construction technique employed at Venta differed from that used at San Lorenzo. Rather than simply piling earth, the builders created their pyramid using layers of different colored clays, alternating bands of material that could only have been visible during the construction process. Suggests that the building itself was a ritual act, that the process of creation mattered as much as the final product. Each layer may have carried symbolic significance, representing cosmological zones or marking passages of sacred time, extending northward from the pyramid. Venta's planners laid out a ceremonial axis that stretched for nearly half a mile. This processional way was flanked by platforms, plazas, and mounds arranged in careful symmetry, creating a formal approach to the sacred precinct at the site's heart. The precision of the layout, oriented 8 degrees west of true north, may have aligned with specific astronomical events, perhaps the setting points of particular stars at certain seasons. Along this axis, the Olmec buried offerings of extraordinary richness. Massive pavements of serpentine blocks, some containing thousands of individual stones transported from sources dozens of miles away, were laid out in patterns and then deliberately buried, never intended to be seen again by human eyes. The labor invested in creating these invisible monuments defies easy explanation. Were they gifts to earth deities, payment for the use of sacred ground? Were they foundations for structures in some supernatural realm that paralleled the visible world? The Olmec left no texts to explain their intentions. The most famous of these buried offerings is the so-called Massive Offering No. 4, a mosaic pavement depicting what appears to be a stylized jaguar face constructed from nearly 500 blocks of serpentine. This image, measuring roughly 15 by 20 feet, was created at ground level and then carefully buried beneath successive layers of clay and earth. The entire process, from quarrying the serpentine to transporting it to La Venta, to shaping and arranging the blocks, to finally concealing the finished work, may have taken years or even decades to complete. Above ground, La Venta displayed monuments intended for ongoing veneration rather than immediate burial. The colossal heads stood in significant locations, portraits of rulers whose authority extended over the site and its surrounding territory. Carved, steely depicted elaborately dressed figures, presumably rulers or priests, engaged in ritual activities or supernatural encounters. Massive, stone altars, some weighing many tons, showed seated figures emerging from niche-like openings, perhaps representing caves or the mouths of earth monsters, connecting the human realm to the underworld powers that Olmec religion invoked. Tombs at Venta revealed the treatment accorded to elite individuals at death. The most elaborate burial discovered, Tomb A, contained the remains of 2 individuals accompanied by jade offerings of exceptional quality. The tomb itself was constructed as a miniature building within a larger mound, with walls of basalt columns and a floor of limestone slabs. Its care invested in this burial, the precious materials consumed, the labor expended on construction, all indicate beliefs about death and afterlife that accorded the deceased continued existence in some form, an existence that required proper equipment and proper housing. The jade buried with Venta's dead included some of the finest examples of Olmec lapidary art, figurines depicting human forms with a distinctive Olmec aesthetic. Heads slightly elongated and tilted back, eyes heavy-lidded, mouths turned down at the corners, demonstrated technical mastery of an extremely difficult material. Jade is harder than steel, requiring patient grinding with abrasives rather than cutting with metal tools. The hours invested in producing a single small figurine must have numbered in the hundreds, making each completed piece a treasure of almost incalculable value. The organization of Venta as a whole reveals a society structured around clear hierarchies and specialized functions. At the apex stood rulers whose portraits gazed out from colossal heads and whose remains were interred with precious goods. Below them ranged various elite groups, perhaps nobles and priests, who occupied the platforms and performed the rituals that maintained cosmic order. Craftsmen produced the objects that elites required, from everyday ceramics to sacred jade carvings, and supporting the entire structure. The common people farmed the rich alluvial soils, fished the abundant waterways, and provided the labor that built and maintained the monumental center. Trade networks connected Venta to distant regions, bringing materials unavailable in the swampy lowlands. Obsidian arrived from volcanic highlands hundreds of miles away, valued for the razor-sharp edges it could hold. Jade came from sources in present-day Guatemala, a journey of similar distance through challenging terrain. Magnetite and ilmenite, minerals used to create the polished mirrors that figured prominently in Olmec ritual life, originated in Oaxaca and Chiapas. The extent of these networks demonstrates that Venta was no isolated outpost, but a node in a web of connections spanning much of Mesoamerica. Around 400 BCE, Venta too came to an end, its monuments defaced and buried, much as San Lorenzo's had been 5 centuries earlier. The pattern repeated itself, ritual destruction followed by abandonment of the sacred precinct, though occupation of the broader area continued at reduced levels. What had been the greatest center of Olmec civilization became another ruin in the swamps, its pyramids eroding, its plazas reverting to forest, its very existence fading from memory until archaeologists arrived millennia later to rediscover what had been lost. Other sites supplemented these primary centers throughout the Olmec era. Tressopotes, where the first colossal head was discovered in 1862, maintained importance across the entire span of Olmec civilization and beyond, bridging the gap between the classic Olmec period and the later cultures that emerged in the region. Laguna de los Cerros, located near the basalt sources of the Tuxtla Mountains, may have served as a specialized center for stone procurement and carving. Numerous smaller sites, their names known only to specialists, filled out the settlement hierarchy, villages and hamlets that supported the great centers with agricultural surplus and labor. The pattern of Olmec urbanism established templates that subsequent Mesoamerican civilizations would follow. The orientation of sites along cardinal axes, the use of elevated platforms to create sacred and elite spaces, the burial of offerings to consecrate ground, the erection of stone monuments to commemorate rulers and events. All these practices that characterized Maya and Aztec cities can be traced back to to Olmec precedents. The mother culture had not only created the first cities, but had defined what cities in this region would mean. The swamps and rivers that had shaped Olmec settlement choices continue to flow today, following channels that have shifted over millennia but still drain the same coastal lowlands. Somewhere beneath their waters and sediments, additional Olmec sites undoubtedly lie waiting for discovery. The archaeological map remains incomplete, and each new excavation has the potential to revise our understanding of how this civilization organized itself across its landscape. The cities of earth and stone have mostly returned to earth, but the questions they raise endure, calling researchers back to the Gulf Coast to continue the work of recovery and interpretation that Matthew Stirling began nearly a century ago. They emerge from the earth like visitors from a dream, these massive stone faces that have become the defining image of Olmec civilization. 17 are known to exist, scattered across 4 sites in the Gulf Coast lowlands, each one a singular achievement of artistic vision and logistical determination. They range in height from about 5 feet to over 11 feet. Their weights measured in tons. Their expressions conveying a presence that transcends the millennia separating their creation from our contemplation. To stand before a colossal head is to encounter something that resists easy categorization, something that is simultaneously portrait and monument, historical record and sacred object. The first question any viewer asks is also the most fundamental. Who are they? The individuality of each face, the specific features that distinguish one head from another, strongly suggests these are portraits of actual people rather than generic representations of deities or abstract concepts. No 2 heads share identical features. Noses vary from broad and flat to more aquiline profiles. Lips range from full and prominent to thinner configurations. Eyes appear in different shapes and with varying degrees of apparent openness. The headdresses or helmets that adorn each head display distinct designs, perhaps indicating different lineages, different achievements, or different ceremonial roles. The consensus among scholars holds that these are portraits of Olmec rulers, kings, or paramount chiefs who commanded sufficient authority to mobilize the enormous resources required for their creation. In this interpretation, each colossal head commemorates a specific individual who held power over the community that produced it, an eternal monument to political authority, frozen in basalt. The practice of creating such portraits may have served multiple functions, legitimizing the ruler's position during his lifetime, ensuring his continued presence and influence after death, and providing a focal point for rituals that reinforced the social order. This interpretation gains support from the headdresses the figures wear. These are not crowns or abstract symbols, but what appear to be functional helmets, similar to those worn by players in the Mesoamerican ballgame. This connection to the ballgame is significant, for that ritual sport carried profound religious and political meanings throughout Mesoamerican history. Rulers often participated in ballgame ceremonies, and the game itself was associated with cosmic struggles between forces of life and death, light and darkness. A ruler depicted wearing ballgame attire would be presenting himself as a cosmic athlete, a champion capable of maintaining the balance between supernatural forces on behalf of his community. The technical challenges involved in creating these monuments were formidable. The stone used for all known colossal heads is basalt, a volcanic rock of exceptional hardness and density. The nearest sources of suitable basalt lay in the Tuxtla Mountains, a volcanic range rising from the coastal plain roughly 50 to 80 miles from the major Olmec centers, depending on the specific site and quarry. Boulders of appropriate size had to be identified, extracted from their natural settings, and transported across a landscape that presented obstacles at every turn. The quarrying process itself required sophisticated understanding of stone and its properties. Basalt is difficult to work, resistant to the techniques that function well with softer stones. The Olmec may have used fire setting, heating the rock face and then rapidly cooling it with water to induce fracturing along desired lines. They may have exploited natural weaknesses in the stone, cracks and joints that could be expanded through the insertion of wooden wedges, subsequently soaked to swell. Whatever methods they employed, the result was the extraction of boulders weighing up to 50 tons. Rough blocks that contained within them the portraits waiting to be revealed. Moving these boulders from mountain quarries to lowland ceremonial centers presents the most daunting logistical puzzle. The Olmec possessed no wheels, no metal tools, no draft animals capable of hauling such weights. They had only human muscle, wood, fiber, rope, and whatever mechanical advantages they could devise from these basic materials. The solutions they developed testified to their ingenuity and organizational capacity. The most widely accepted theory involves a combination of overland sledging and water transport. From the quarry sites, boulders could be moved downslope using wooden sledges or rollers, a challenging but achievable undertaking given sufficient labor and careful management of gradients. The goal would be to reach a navigable waterway, one of the rivers that drain the Tuxtla Highlands toward the coastal plain. Once at the water's edge, the stone could be loaded onto rafts or barges for the journey downstream. Constructing watercraft capable of supporting multi-ton loads required specialized knowledge and materials. Balsa wood, known for its exceptional buoyancy, may have provided the flotation necessary to keep massive stones from sinking the vessels that carried them. Multiple logs lashed together could create a stable platform, and a careful distribution of weight would prevent capsizing during the journey. The rivers themselves offered relatively calm conditions during certain seasons, though floods and currents posed constant hazards that required experienced navigation. The final leg of each monument's journey, from riverbank to installation site, again demanded overland transport. At San Lorenzo, this meant hauling stones up the slopes of the plateau to their designated positions. At Venta, it meant moving them across the island's relatively flat terrain to the ceremonial precinct. In either case, teams of workers pulling on ropes, combined with log rollers or sledges to reduce friction, gradually moved each boulder toward its destination. The entire process, from quarry to installation, may have taken months or even years for a single stone. Once a boulder reached its destination, the work of carving could begin. Olmec sculptors approached their medium with confidence, born of experience, tacking the hard basalt with stone tools and abrasives that slowly revealed the portrait within. They would have begun by roughing out the basic form, removing large amounts of excess material to establish the overall dimensions and orientation of the finished head. Progressively finer work defined the features, shaping the nose and lips, carving the distinctive helmets, achieving the surface finish that characterizes completed examples. The tools available for this work were simple but effective in skilled hands. Harder stones served as hammers and chisels, their edges blunted with use and constantly resharpened or replaced. Abrasive sands, rubbed across surfaces with leather or wood, smoothed away tool marks and created the polished finish visible on the best preserved examples. The time required to complete a single head, working with these manual techniques, must have numbered in the thousands of hours, perhaps spanning years of sustained effort by teams of specialized craftsmen. 10 colossal heads have been found at San Lorenzo more than any other site. They were discovered in various states of preservation, some relatively intact, others showing signs of deliberate mutilation. The damage inflicted on certain heads appears intentional rather than accidental. Features systematically ground away or knocked off rather than simply weathered by time. This pattern of destruction, combined with the burial of heads in ravines at the edges of the plateau, suggests some kind of ritual termination or political upheaval that targeted these symbols of authority. The 4 heads from Venta were arranged within the ceremonial precinct according to a plan whose logic we can only partially reconstruct. They stood at significant locations, marking important points along the site's sacred axis or guarding approaches to ritual spaces. Unlike the San Lorenzo heads, those at Venta were not dramatically mutilated. though they were eventually buried as part of the site's termination. Their preservation allows us to appreciate details that damage has obscured at other locations. Tres Zapotes, where the very first colossal head was discovered in 1862, has yielded 2 examples. This site's long occupation, spanning the entire Olmec period and continuing into later eras, makes it difficult to date these heads precisely. They may represent the later phase of the colossal head tradition, created as Venta's influence waned in regional centers, asserted greater independence. A single head from Rancho La Cobata, discovered in 1970, brings the total to 17. Though additional examples may await discovery beneath the swamps and forests of the Gulf Coast, each head possesses individual characteristics that reward close examination. Monument 1 from San Lorenzo, among the largest known at over 9 feet tall, depicts a figure with a particularly broad nose and thick lips, wearing a helmet decorated with what may be jaguar paw designs. The expression suggests calm authority, a ruler secure in his power and status. Monument 17 from the same site, by contrast, shows a face with more angular features and a helmet of different design, perhaps indicating a different lineage or era. The Venta heads include Monument 1, often called the Granddaddy for its impressive size of over 8 feet in height. This head shows a figure wearing a helmet with distinctive side pieces that extend down past the ears, and the expression combines serenity with a hint of severity. Monument 4 from Venta displays what some observers have interpreted as a faint smile, a subtle upturning of the lips that gives the face a more approachable quality than some of its counterparts. The diversity among the heads extends to their helmets as well. These coverings display a remarkable variety of designs, from relatively plain examples to elaborately decorated versions featuring what appear to be carved symbols or emblems. Some helmets include chin straps, others do not. Some feature raised ridges or knobs, others present smoother surfaces. These variations carried meaning for the Olmec, indicating clan affiliations, military achievements, ritual roles, or other distinctions. That significance remains beyond our current ability to decipher. The African origin theory that Jose Maria Melgar proposed after viewing the first discovered head has proven remarkably persistent despite overwhelming evidence against it. Proponents of this idea point to the facial features of the heads, particularly the broad noses and full lips of some examples, as evidence of African ancestry among the Olmec. They suggest transatlantic contact between Africa and Mesoamerica, perhaps Phoenician sailors or Egyptian explorers who somehow reached the New World and influenced or founded Olmec civilization. This theory does not withstand serious scrutiny. The features cited as evidence of African origin fall well within the range of variation found among indigenous American populations, particularly those of the tropical lowlands. The Olmec themselves, based on skeletal remains and artistic depictions in other media, were clearly indigenous Mesoamericans with no biological connection to African populations. The distribution of features across the 17 known heads shows considerable variation, with some faces displaying characteristics quite different from those that prompted the African hypothesis. Moreover, no credible evidence supports transatlantic contact during the Olmec period. No African artifacts have been found in Olmec contexts. No African crops or animals appear in the archaeological record. No African genetic markers have been identified in studies of ancient Mesoamerican DNA. The African origin theory persists not because of evidence in its favor, but because of the difficulty some observers have in accepting that indigenous Americans independently developed sophisticated civilizations without outside assistance. The colossal heads remain powerful precisely because they are products of indigenous American genius. The Olmec looked at massive boulders of volcanic stone and envisioned portraits of their rulers. They developed techniques for extracting those boulders from mountains and transporting them across challenging terrain. They created tools and methods for shaping the hardest rock into naturalistic representations of human faces. And they did all of this through their own innovation and effort, without models from across the sea, without instruction from more advanced civilizations elsewhere in the world. What happened to the heads after the Olmec civilization ended remains partially mysterious. Some were buried, deliberately interred as part of rituals that terminated the sacred power of the sites where they stood. Others were mutilated, their features defaced in acts that may have represented political revolution, religious transformation, or ritual sacrifice of the monuments themselves. Some appear to have been reworked, their original forms modified to serve new purposes or represent new individuals, though this interpretation remains controversial. The heads that survived to be rediscovered carried the marks of their long burial. Weathering has softened some features. Root action from plants growing above them has stained surfaces. The original paint that almost certainly decorated these monuments, giving them colors and details now lost, disappeared long ago. What we see today is basalt, stripped of its embellishment, powerful but incomplete, like a building seen only in its structural bones, without the furnishings that once gave it life. Modern Mexicans have embraced the colossal heads as national symbols, emblems of indigenous achievement that counter narratives of pre-Columbian America as a cultural backwater awaiting European enlightenment. The heads appear on currency, in museum displays, and in public spaces throughout the country. Reproductions and replicas proliferate, bringing the Olmec aesthetic to audiences who may never visit the original sites. In this way, the rulers commemorated in these portraits have achieved an immortality their creators could scarcely have imagined. Their faces known to millions who will never learn their names. The originals now reside mostly in museums, protected from the elements and from the human activities that threaten archaeological sites throughout Mexico. The Museo de Antropología in Xalapa houses the largest collection, including several San Lorenzo heads displayed in settings that attempt to convey something of their original impact. Visitors stand before these faces and ask the same questions that have fascinated scholars for more than a century. Who were you? What did you accomplish? What did you believe? The stone faces offer no answers, only the mute testimony of their enduring presence, evidence that someone once lived and ruled and was considered worthy of commemoration in the most permanent medium available. Somewhere in the Tuxtla Mountains, outcrops of basalt still hold boulders that the Olmec never claimed. Perhaps future quarrying or erosion will reveal additional raw materials that ancient sculptors evaluated and rejected. Not quite right for the visions they sought to realize. And somewhere in the swamps and forests of the Gulf Coast, additional colossal heads may lie buried, waiting the chance discovery or systematic survey that will add to the 17 now known. The earth of the Olmec homeland has not surrendered all its secrets. And the story of the colossal heads may yet have chapters unwritten. The Jaguar watches from the shadows of Olmec art, its presence woven through every medium and every period of this ancient civilization, crouches on carved thrones and snarls from ceremonial axes. Its features merge with human faces in unsettling combinations that blur the boundary between species. Its claws and fangs appear as decorative elements on objects of the highest status, marking their owners as participants in mysteries that centered on this most powerful of American predators. To understand Olmec religion is to follow the Jaguar into darkness, into the supernatural realm where transformation was possible and where human rulers claimed kinship with forces beyond ordinary comprehension. The Jaguar held a unique position in the ancient Mesoamerican imagination. It was the apex predator of the tropical forests, capable of killing prey many times its size with a single crushing bite to the skull. It moved through the night with perfect stealth, its body coat providing camouflage that rendered it nearly invisible in the dappled shadows of the forest floor. It could swim rivers and climb trees at home in every environment the tropical world offered. And its roar, A deep, coughing sound that carried through the forest announced a presence that commanded respect from every creature within hearing. For the Olmec, the Jaguar embodied power in its most concentrated form, the strength that allowed it to drag prey larger than itself up into trees, the ferocity that made it feared by all other animals, the stealth that enabled it to approach victims undetected. These qualities translated readily into metaphors for political and spiritual authority. A ruler who could claim Jaguar attributes possessed power that transcended mere human capacity. He could see in the darkness where others were blind. He could strike from concealment with overwhelming force. He moved between worlds as the Jaguar moved between forest and river, earth and trees. The most distinctive expression of this Jaguar symbolism appears in what scholars call the word Jaguar motif. This recurring image depicts figures that combine human and feline characteristics, typically showing faces with the downturned mouths and snarling expressions of jaguars, while retaining overall human form. The proportions are often those of infants, with large heads and soft, rounded bodies, leading some researchers to term these figures jaguar babies. The combination is deliberately unsettling, evoking something that exists outside normal categories, neither fully human nor fully animal, but partaking of both natures. Interpretations of the word Jaguar have varied considerably over the decades of Olmec scholarship. Early researchers proposed that the Olmec practiced a form of totemism, claiming descent from Jaguar ancestors and depicting this mythical ancestry in their art. Others suggested that word Jaguar images represented a rain deity. Noting similarities between the crying or grimacing expressions of these figures and the falling of rain from storm clouds. Still others have connected the motif to shamanistic practices, proposing that Olmec ritual specialists believed they could transform into jaguars during trance states induced by hallucinogenic substances. This last interpretation has gained considerable support from comparative evidence. Key: throughout the Americas, indigenous peoples have traditions of shamanic transformation. The belief that specially trained individuals can send their spirits into animal bodies or assume animal forms through ritual means. The jaguar features prominently in these traditions, particularly in South America, where shamans of various cultures claimed the ability to become jaguars and travel through supernatural realms. Similar beliefs existed among the Olmec. The word jaguar images might depict shamans in the process of transformation, capturing the moment when human and animal natures merged. The evidence for Olmec use of psychoactive substances, while circumstantial, supports the shamanic interpretation. Certain plants native to the Gulf Coast region contain compounds capable of inducing altered states of consciousness, including morning glory seeds and various species of hallucinogenic mushrooms. Olmec art depicts what may be mushrooms in ritual contexts, and some figurines show individuals in postures suggestive of trance states. If Olmec priests or rulers consumed these substances as part of religious ceremonies, the visions they experienced might well have included sensations of animal transformation that found expression in word jaguar imagery. Beyond the word jaguar, Olmec religion encompassed a pantheon of supernatural beings whose forms and attributes laid foundations for later Mesoamerican theology. Among the most significant was a creature that scholars call the Olmec dragon, composite being combining features of multiple animals, including jaguar, eagle, and serpent. This monster appears in various configurations across Olmec art, sometimes emphasizing one set of animal characteristics, sometimes another, but always conveying a sense of supernatural power drawn from multiple sources. Possibly, the Olmec dragon may represent an early form of the feathered serpent, not most persistent of Mesoamerican deities, who would eventually be known as Quetzalcoatl to the Aztecs and Kukulkan to the Maya. The combination of serpentine body with avian attributes, particularly feathers and sometimes wings, creates a being that unites earth and sky. The crawling realm of snakes with the soaring realm of birds, this union of opposites, so fundamental to later Mesoamerican religious thought, appears already present in Olmec iconography, suggesting that core theological concepts emerged very early in the region's cultural development. Another recurring supernatural figure has been identified as a maize god, a deity associated with the corn plant that formed the agricultural foundation of Mesoamerican civilization. Maize was not merely a food source, but a sacred substance, the very stuff from which the gods had created humanity, according to later Maya mythology. If the Olmec held similar beliefs, as the prominence of maize symbolism in their art suggests, then the maize god represented nothing less than the source of human existence and the guarantee of continued life through agricultural fertility. Olmec representations of this deity typically show a figure with maize imagery incorporated into the headdress or sprouting from the head itself. The iconography connects the god directly to the plant, identifying divine and vegetable so closely that they become aspects of a single sacred reality. Rituals honoring this deity would have accompanied the agricultural cycle, marking planting and harvest with ceremonies designed to ensure the cooperation of supernatural forces with human needs. The infrastructure of Olmec religion included not only these specific deities, but also a cosmological framework that organized the universe into meaningful patterns. Like later Mesoamerican peoples, the Olmec appear to have conceived of the world in terms of cardinal directions, with each direction associated with specific colors, animals, supernatural beings, and qualities. The careful orientation of their ceremonial centers along north-south axis reflects this directional symbolism, anchoring human settlements within a cosmic geography that extended far beyond the visible landscape. Vertical dimensions complemented these horizontal ones. The Olmec world likely included multiple levels of reality, an upper realm associated with sky and celestial bodies, a middle realm where humans lived out their earthly existence, in a lower realm beneath the earth's surface where supernatural beings dwelt and where the dead journeyed after life. Caves held particular significance as access points between these levels. Natural portals through which communication with underworld powers became possible. The depiction of figures emerging from cave-like openings on Olmec altars may represent rulers claiming the ability to traverse these cosmic boundaries, descending to the underworld and returning with knowledge or power unavailable to ordinary people. Ritual practice translated these theological concepts into concrete action. The Olmec built elaborate ceremonial spaces where priests and rulers could perform the rites that maintained cosmic order and secured supernatural favor. These rituals almost certainly included offerings, the presentation of valuable goods to supernatural recipients in exchange for continued benefits. The buried caches discovered at Venta, with their serpentine pavements and jade treasures, represent such offerings on a massive scale, gifts to powers beneath the earth, too precious to be seen again by human eyes. The question of human sacrifice among the Olmec remains contested. Later Mesoamerican civilizations, including the Maya and Aztec, practiced human sacrifice as a central element of their religious systems, offering the blood and lives of captives or designated victims to sustain the gods and maintain the cycles of time. If the Olmec originated other aspects of Mesoamerican religion, did they also establish this most dramatic of ritual practices? The evidence is suggestive, but not conclusive. Some Olmec sculptures depict scenes that could represent sacrifice, figures holding limp or bound individuals in postures consistent with ritual killing. The discovery of human remains in contexts that suggest sacrificial death, such as burials associated with monument dedications, adds archaeological support to artistic interpretation. But the fragmentary nature of the evidence prevents confident conclusions. The Olmec may have practiced human sacrifice, or the images we interpret as depicting it may have carried meanings we do not fully understand. What seems clear is that Olmec religion placed enormous emphasis on the relationship between human rulers and supernatural powers, the colossal heads, the elaborate tombs, the buried offerings of incalculable value, all point to a system in which political authority derived from spiritual connections. Rulers were not merely administrators or military leaders, but mediators between worlds, individuals whose special status allowed them to communicate with gods and ancestors on behalf of their communities. Their elaborate regalia, preserved in jade figurines and carved on stone monuments, displayed symbols that marked them as participants in supernatural realms. The ball game served as one arena where these cosmic dramas played out. It's a ritual sport played throughout Mesoamerica for more than 3,000 years. Evolved teams attempted to move a heavy rubber ball through a court without using their hands. The rules and scoring systems varied across time and space, but the deeper significance remained consistent. The ball game reenacted cosmic struggles, the movements of celestial bodies, its conflicts between supernatural forces that determined the fate of the world. Players were not merely athletes, but ritual actors. Their physical contest, a form of divination or intervention in cosmic processes. Olmec sites show evidence of ball courts and ball game equipment, confirming that this tradition reached back to the very beginnings of Mesoamerican civilization. The depiction of rulers wearing ball game gear on colossal heads suggests that the highest elites participated, staking their prestige and perhaps their lives on the outcomes. The rubber ball itself, produced from the latex of trees native to the Olmec Heartland, may have originated as an Olmec innovation, another gift from the mother culture to all the civilizations that followed. The Tahitians, the religious worldview encoded in Olmec art and architecture, provided a comprehensive framework for understanding existence. Every phenomenon had its place within this system, from the movements of stars to the growth of maize plants to the fortunes of individual humans. Priests possessed the specialized knowledge necessary to read the signs and interpret the patterns, advising rulers on propitious moments for action and identifying the rituals necessary to address problems. This integration of the natural and supernatural, the political and the spiritual, characterized Mesoamerican thought throughout its history, and the foundations were laid in the swamps of the Gulf Coast 3,000 years ago. The Olmec gods have not entirely disappeared. When Catholic missionaries arrived in Mesoamerica, 1,500 years after the last Olmec center was abandoned, I found indigenous peoples still worshiping deities whose roots reached back to Olmec times. The feathered serpent had evolved through Maya and Aztec iterations, but remained recognizable. Maize rituals continued to mark the agricultural cycle. Jaguar symbolism persisted in shamanic traditions that survived conquest and conversion. These continuities testify to the enduring power of the religious ideas first given form in Olmec ceremonial centers. Even today, in villages scattered through the former Olmec heartland, traditions persist that may carry echoes of beliefs 3 millennia old. Healers work with techniques passed down through countless generations. Farmers perform small rituals before planting, acknowledging powers in the earth that their ancestors also recognized. The jungle that reclaimed the ancient sites never fully erased the ideas that those sites embodied. The word Jaguar still watches from the shadows, and the feathered serpent still moves between earth and sky. Their ancient presence woven into the fabric of a landscape that remembers what human records have forgotten. The night falls softly over the Gulf Coast lowlands, and in the darkness, the old powers stir. Somewhere, a jaguar coughs its hunting call, the same sound that Olmec priests heard as they prepared their rituals beneath monuments now buried and forgotten. The gods they worshipped have changed their names and their forms, but something of their essence persists, passed down through all the cultures that built upon Olmec foundations. To study Olmec religion is to trace these deep continuities. To understand how ideas about the sacred took shape in one time and place and then flowed outward through centuries and across continents, shaping the spiritual lives of millions who never knew the name of the civilization that started it all. The jade glows with an inner light, green fire captured in stone, and shaped by hands that understood both the material and the meanings it could carry. No substance held greater value in the Olmec world than this metamorphic rock, prized above gold, above silver, above any of the precious metals that later civilizations would covet. Jade was the color of growing maize, the life-giving waters that sustained agriculture, of the quetzal feathers that adorned the highest nobility. To possess jade was to possess concentrated essence of vitality itself, and the Olmec worked this difficult material with a mastery that has never been surpassed. The technical challenges of jade carving pushed ancient craftsmen to the limits of their capabilities. Jade is not a single mineral, but a term encompassing two distinct materials, jadeite and nephrite, both characterized by extreme hardness and toughness. The Olmec worked primarily with jadeite, the harder of the two, a stone that cannot be carved with metal tools and resists even modern steel. The only effective technique involves patient grinding with abrasives, slowly wearing away material grain by grain until the desired form emerges. A single small figurine might require hundreds of hours of sustained effort, making finished jade objects among the most labor-intensive artifacts any ancient culture produced. The Olmec obtained their jade from sources in present-day Guatemala, particularly the Motagua River Valley, where geological processes had created deposits of exceptional quality. This region lay hundreds of miles from the Olmec Heartland, separated by mountains, rivers, and forests that made overland travel arduous and time-consuming. The presence of Guatemalan jade in Olmec contexts demonstrates the extent of trade networks that connected distant regions, networks through which not only materials but also ideas and influences flowed. The journey, a piece of jade made from Guatemalan source to Olmec workshop, and finally to buried offering or elite tomb traced paths of extraordinary length. Traders or expeditions must have traveled to the jade sources, selected appropriate raw materials, and transported them back across the intervening landscape. The logistics involved suggest organized commerce rather than casual exchange. Regularized systems for acquiring valued goods that required planning, investment, and protection along dangerous routes. Once raw jade reached Olmec craftsmen, the painstaking process of transformation began. Workers first roughed out the basic shape of the intended object, removing excess material through techniques that may have included sawing with abrasive charged cords and pecking with harder stones. This initial shaping established the overall form while conserving as much of the precious material as possible. Jade was too valuable to waste, and skilled craftsmen learned to envision finished objects within rough blocks, minimizing the amount of material that needed to be removed. The finest Olmec jade work displays an aesthetic that scholars have come to recognize as distinctively their own. Human figures carved in jade share characteristics with those depicted in other media. The same elongated heads, tilted slightly backward. It's the same heavy-lidded eyes, the same downturned mouths that give Olmec faces their characteristic expression. But jade allowed refinements of detail impossible in larger-scale stonework, delicate features, and subtle modeling that revealed the full extent of Olmec artistic sophistication. The so-called baby-face figurines represent one of the most common and most enigmatic categories of Olmec jade carving. These small sculptures, typically ranging from a few inches to perhaps a foot in height, depict figures with the proportions of infants, large heads atop bodies with soft, rounded contours. Their faces often display the word Jaguar characteristics discussed earlier, snarling mouths and cleft heads that suggest supernatural rather than human identity. The combination of infantile form with fierce expression creates an unsettling effect, beings that seem innocent and threatening simultaneously. Scholars have proposed various interpretations of these figures. Some see them as representations of rain deities, divine beings whose tears brought the precipitation necessary for agriculture. Others connect them to beliefs about human jaguar unions, the supernatural origin of ruling lineages through matings between jaguars and human women. Still others interpret them as shamanic imagery, depicting the transformed state of ritual specialists who had assumed Jaguar form through trance and spiritual journey. The multiplicity of interpretations reflects both the richness of the imagery and the limitations of our understanding. Among the most remarkable Olmec jade objects are the masks, full-face depictions apparently intended to be worn or displayed rather than buried with the dead. These masks show the idealized Olmec physiognomy in its most refined form, features reduced to essential shapes and polished to a high sheen that catches and reflects light. Some masks show evidence of having been worn, with drilled holes for attachment and patterns of wear, consistent with use over extended periods. Others appear to have been made for burial, accompanying the dead into whatever afterlife the Olmec envisioned. The famous jade mask from Rio Pesquero exemplifies the heights Olmec lapidaries could achieve. This life-sized face, carved from a single piece of blue-green jade of exceptional quality, depicts features of striking naturalism combined with the stylization characteristic of Olmec art. The eyes, originally inlaid with some other material now lost, would have given the mask an even more lifelike appearance. The surface finish, smooth as glass across the entire face, required countless hours of patient polishing to achieve. No finer example of Olmec jade work has ever been discovered. Beyond jade, the Olmec worked with obsidian, volcanic glass that offered qualities jade could not provide. Where jade was valued for its color and its toughness, obsidian was prized for the edges it could hold, sharper than any metal and capable of slicing through flesh and fiber with surgical precision. Obsidian tools served practical purposes throughout Mesoamerican history. But the Olmec also transformed this material into objects of ritual significance that transcended mere utility. The obsidian mirrors represent perhaps the most intriguing application of this material in Olmec contexts. Craftsmen selected pieces of obsidian with suitable properties, then ground and polished one surface until it achieved a reflective quality comparable to modern glass. These mirrors, typically concave in form, could produce images when held at the proper distance and angle. Dark reflections that revealed the viewer's face surrounded by the deep black of the volcanic glass. The significance of these mirrors extended far beyond vanity. In Mesoamerican thought, mirrors served as portals between worlds, surfaces through which one could glimpse supernatural realms or communicate with beings beyond ordinary perception. Shamans used mirrors as tools for divination and spirit contact, gazing into the dark surfaces to induce trance states and receive visions. The concave form of many Olmec mirrors would have produced distorted images, faces stretched and altered in ways that might have seemed to reveal hidden truths or supernatural aspects of the viewer. Some Olmec mirrors were made not from obsidian, but from iron or minerals, magnetite and ilmenite, that could be polished to similar reflective surfaces. These materials came from sources in Oaxaca and other highland regions, adding to the list of goods that trade networks brought to the Gulf Coast lowlands. The effort invested in obtaining these materials and transforming them into mirrors indicates the importance such objects held in Olmec ritual practice. Pottery represents the most abundant category of Olmec material culture. The everyday ceramics that served practical purposes alongside the prestige goods that receive more scholarly attention. Olmec potters produce vessels in a wide range of forms, from simple cooking pots to elaborate serving dishes decorated with carved or incised designs. The quality of this ceramic work, even at the level of utilitarian wares, demonstrates technical competence developed over generations of practice and refinement. Elite pottery displayed the same iconographic vocabulary found in other Olmec media. Vessels might be shaped to represent supernatural beings, their walls forming the bodies of war jaguars or Olmec dragons. Surfaces might carry carved scenes depicting rituals, mythological narratives, or portraits of rulers and deities. These elaborate ceramics served in ceremonies where their imagery reinforced the messages communicated through other channels, creating an immersive symbolic environment within which religious and political meanings were produced and reproduced. The so-called hollow baby figurines constitute a distinctive category of Olmec ceramic art. These white-slipped sculptures, typically 12 to 15 inches in height, depict nude figures with the characteristic baby face features. Their bodies are rendered with surprising naturalism, soft flesh, and subtle anatomical details that demonstrate close observation of actual infant forms. The expressions on their faces range from serene to crying, the open mouths of some examples revealing carefully modeled gums and emerging teeth. Whatever these figures represented, their makers invested extraordinary skill in their production. Smaller ceramic figurines appear in abundance at Olmec sites as mass-produced objects that may have served in household rituals or as offerings at shrines. These standardized forms, lacking the individual attention lavished on elite works, nonetheless revealed the pervasiveness of Olmec religious imagery throughout society. Even common people, those who could never afford jade masks or hollow baby figures, could participate in the symbolic system through these accessible objects. The distribution of Olmec-style artifacts across Mesoamerica raises questions about the mechanisms through which goods and ideas spread. Some objects were clearly produced in the Olmec Heartland and transported to distant locations, their style and materials marking them as imports from the Gulf Coast. Others were produced locally in imitation of Olmec models, evidence of the prestige that Olmec culture commanded even among peoples hundreds of miles from its centers. Distinguishing imports from local productions requires careful analysis of materials and manufacturing techniques, research that continues to refine our understanding of ancient exchange networks. The raw materials that flowed into the Olmec Heartland came from diverse sources spanning much of Mesoamerica: obsidian from Guatemala, obsidian from highland Mexico, magnetite from Oaxaca, serpentine from various mountain regions, greenstone from sources scattered across the landscape. The Olmec centers acted as nodes in a web of exchange that connected ecologically and culturally distinct regions, drawing resources from the margins and redistributing finished goods in patterns that enforced political and economic relationships. So what the Olmec offered in return for these imports remains less clear. The swampy lowlands of the Gulf Coast lacked mineral resources that might have balanced the trade in jade and obsidian. But the region produced other valuables, most notably the rubber that gave the later Olmec their Aztec-derived name. The rubber tree thrives in the humid tropical environment of Veracruz and Tabasco, and its latex provided the material for the balls used in the sacred ball game throughout Mesoamerica. Rubber was indeed an Olmec export. It would have been essential to religious practices across the region, creating dependencies that tied distant peoples to the Gulf Coast producers. Cacao may have served similar functions. Cacao drink derived from cacao beans held sacred significance in Mesoamerican culture, consumed in rituals and offered to gods from Olmec times through the Aztec period. The plant grows well in the humid conditions of the Gulf Coast, and the Olmec may have been early cultivators and exporters of this precious crop. Like rubber, cacao would have given the Olmec leverage in their dealings with peoples who desired products only they could reliably supply. The objects that survive from Olmec workshops, the jade masks and obsidian mirrors, the hollow babies and ceramic vessels, represent only a fraction of what these craftsmen produced. Perishable materials, textiles and featherwork, and carved wood have vanished entirely, leaving gaps in our understanding that can never be filled. The Olmec surely created elaborate costumes for their rulers and priests, headdresses and cloaks and regalia of stunning complexity. They surely decorated their buildings with paintings and hangings that complemented the stone sculptures we can still study. All of this is lost, recoverable only through inference and imagination. What remains is nonetheless sufficient to establish the Olmec as masters of their craft, artists and artisans whose work set standards that subsequent cultures would strive to match. The jade carvings that emerge from Olmec tombs rival, any produced in ancient China or New Zealand. The other great jade working traditions of the ancient world. The ceramic artistry, visible in hollow baby figures and decorated vessels, demonstrates creative sophistication of the highest order. The obsidian mirrors and their iron ore counterparts show materials science applied in service of spiritual practice. Technology and religion intertwined in ways characteristic of Olmec culture as a whole. The workshops where these objects were made have mostly vanished. Their locations within Olmec sites difficult to identify after millennia of decay and disturbance. But the products of those workshops endure testimony to the skill and dedication of craftsmen whose names we will never know. Each jade figurine, each polished mirror, each painted vessel carries within it the accumulated knowledge of generations. Techniques passed from master to apprentice across centuries of continuous tradition. The objects speak for the people who made them, silent witnesses to achievements that deserve remembrance, even as the civilization that produced them fades into the depths of time. The stone emerged from the earth in 1999, a flat slab of serpentine bearing marks that no one had seen for nearly 3,000 years. Workers quarrying fill for a road construction project near the village of Cascayo in the Mexican state of Veracruz noticed the unusual object and set it aside, recognizing that something about it demanded attention. When scholars finally examined the find, they realized they were looking at the oldest known example of writing in the Americas, text that pushed back the origins of Mesoamerican literacy by centuries and confirmed what many had long suspected. The Olmec had developed writing, and with it came the capacity to record and transmit knowledge across time in ways that purely oral traditions could not match. The Cascayo block, as the artifact came to be known, measures roughly 14 inches long, 8 inches wide, and 5 inches thick. One surface bears 62 symbols arranged in horizontal sequences that read, as best scholars can determine, from left to right. The symbols themselves depict recognizable objects, insects and plants and fish in geometric forms, rendered in a style consistent with other Olmec artistic production. This is not random decoration, but organized text, a message from the past that we cannot yet fully read. The discovery ignited both excitement and controversy within the scholarly community. Some researchers embraced the Cascayo block as definitive proof of Olmec writing, vindication of long-held theories about the precocity of this civilization. Others raised questions about the artifact's context and authenticity, noting that it had not been excavated under controlled archaeological conditions and that its original position within the site remained unknown. The debates continue, but the weight of evidence has generally supported the block's authenticity and its identification as a genuine Olmec text. What the text says remains frustratingly unclear. The 62 symbols employ a repertoire of perhaps 28 distinct signs, some repeated multiple times within the inscription. The sequences show patterns suggestive of grammatical structure, possible word boundaries, and syntactic units that imply organized language rather than mere pictorial listing. But without additional text for comparison, without a bilingual inscription or living tradition to provide keys, the code remains unbroken. We can see that the Olmec wrote, but we cannot read what they wrote. This limitation places the Cascayo block in a category shared by other undeciphered scripts from around the world, writing systems whose structures we can analyze, but whose contents we cannot access. The Indus Valley script, Linear A from Minoan Crete, the Rongo of Easter Island, all present similar frustrations. We know these were meaningful communications, organized according to rules that their creators understood. We simply lack the information necessary to recover those rules and apply them. The implications of Olmec writing extend far beyond the single artifact from Cascayo. If the Olmec developed writing, then other texts almost certainly existed. Inscriptions on monuments and objects that have been lost to time or that await discovery beneath the swamps and forests of the Gulf Coast. The perishable materials that likely carried most Olmec writing, bark paper, or animal skins, or woven textiles, have vanished entirely, leaving only hints of what might have been recorded. Libraries of Olmec knowledge may have existed, collections of texts that documented history, mythology, astronomical observations, and administrative records. All of this is gone, leaving us with a single stone and the questions it raises. Its connection between Olmec writing and later Mesoamerican scripts remains a subject of active investigation. The Maya developed the most sophisticated writing system in the pre-Columbian Americas, a fully phonetic script capable of recording any word in their language with precision. Maya writing appeared in its mature form during the first centuries of the Common Era, more than a millennium after the Olmec flourished. The intervening period saw the development of other scripts, including the Zapotic writing of Oaxaca and the Isthmian or Epi-Olmec script that emerged in the Gulf Coast region after the classic Olmec period ended. Whether these later scripts descended from an Olmec ancestor or developed independently remains debated. The Cascale block symbols do not closely resemble the signs used in Maya or Zapotic writing, suggesting that if a connection exists, it involves principles of organization rather than specific sign forms. The very concept of writing, the idea that spoken language could be represented through visual marks, may have been the Olmec contribution, even if the particular symbols used evolved and changed as the concept spread to other peoples and other regions. Alongside writing, the Olmec developed systems for tracking time that would prove equally influential. The Mesoamerican calendar, in its various forms, represents one of the great intellectual achievements of the ancient world, a framework for organizing human activity within cosmic cycles that structured life for 3,000 years. The origins of this calendrical tradition lie in the Olmec period, though the full complexity of later systems developed over subsequent centuries. Two interlocking cycles form the core of Mesoamerican timekeeping. The first, a ritual calendar of 260 days, combined 20 named days with 13 numbers to create a cycle used for divination, ceremony, and the determination of auspicious moments. The origins of this 260-day period remain uncertain, though various theories connected to agricultural cycles, human gestation, or astronomical phenomena. Whatever its source, this ritual calendar persisted throughout Mesoamerican history, still in use among some Maya communities today. The second cycle tracked the solar year of 365 days, divided into 18 months of 20 days each, plus a dangerous 5-day period at year's end. This calendar governed agricultural activity and civic life, marking seasons for planting and harvest, for festivals and markets. The combination of the two cycles created a larger period of 52 years, after which the calendars realigned and a new cycle began. This 52 year-round structured Mesoamerican historical consciousness, with events often recorded in terms of their position within these recurring periods. Beyond these cycles, the Maya and their predecessors developed the long count, a system for tracking absolute time from a fixed starting point. Its calendar expressed dates as counts of days elapsed since a mythological creation event, allowing precise placement of events within a linear temporal framework that extended millions of years into past and future. The long count appears on monuments dating to the late Olmec and Epi-Olmec periods, suggesting that this sophisticated system emerged from foundations laid during the classic Olmec era. The famous Stela C from Tres Zapotes bears one of the earliest long count dates yet discovered, corresponding to September 3rd, 32 BCE in our calendar. This monument, fragmentary and worn, demonstrates that the mathematical and astronomical knowledge necessary for long count calculations existed in the Olmec Heartland centuries before Maya civilization reached its height. The intellectual achievements we associate with the Maya, the precise astronomical tables, and the elaborate historical records built upon Olmec precedents that made such developments possible. The mathematics underlying these calendrical systems required conceptual breakthroughs of fundamental importance. Mesoamerican mathematics operated in base 20 rather than the base 10 familiar to most modern users. A choice perhaps reflecting the combined total of human fingers and toes. More significantly, Mesoamerican mathematicians developed the concept of zero as a placeholder, a mathematical abstraction that many cultures never achieved independently. The zero allowed positional notation, the representation of large numbers through the placement of digits rather than the accumulation of symbols, making complex calculations feasible. The bar and dot notation used throughout Mesoamerica provided an elegant system for representing numerical values. Dots stood for ones, bars for fives, and combinations of these simple elements could express any number within the vigesimal system. This notation appears on Olmec monuments and artifacts, confirming that the basic elements of Mesoamerican mathematics were in place during the earliest period of complex civilization in the region. Astronomical observation provided the empirical foundation for calendrical precision. The movements of sun, moon, and planets followed patterns that patient watchers could detect and predict. Cycles that structured the passage of time in ways accessible to human understanding. Mesoamerican astronomers tracked these cycles with remarkable accuracy, determining the length of the solar year, the phases of the moon, and the appearances of Venus with precision that rivaled or exceeded contemporary achievements in the Old World. Evidence for Olmec astronomical practice comes primarily from the orientation of their sites and monuments. The careful alignment of ceremonial centers along axes that corresponded to significant astronomical events, solstices and equinoxes, and the rising and setting points of important celestial bodies, indicates systematic observation over extended periods. Buildings and monuments served not only ritual functions, but also astronomical ones, their positions marking the cosmic coordinates within which human life unfolded. The transfer of knowledge from generation to generation required systems beyond writing, methods for training specialists and preserving expertise across the span of individual lifetimes. Olmec society must have included individuals dedicated to intellectual pursuits, priests or scribes, whose responsibilities included maintaining calendrical calculations, cues, interpreting celestial signs, and recording the information necessary for continued accuracy. These specialists formed the earliest Mesoamerican intelligentsia, keepers of knowledge that set their civilization apart from simpler societies surrounding them. The schools where such individuals received their training. The methods by which complex information passed from masters to students remain invisible in the archaeological record. We can only infer their existence from the products they created. The monuments with their carved dates, the astronomical alignments of ceremonial architecture, the mathematical concepts embedded in calendrical systems. The knowledge itself testifies to the institutions that produced and maintained it, even when those institutions leave no direct traces. The integration of writing, mathematics, and astronomy created a comprehensive intellectual framework that organized Olmec understanding of the world. Time was not merely experienced, but calculated, not merely lived, but recorded. Events could be placed within cosmic cycles that gave them meaning beyond their immediate occurrence. The past became accessible through written records, the future predictable through astronomical knowledge. This transformation of human relationship to time constitutes one of the most profound achievements of any ancient civilization. The legacy of these intellectual accomplishments extended far beyond the Olmec Heartland and far beyond the Olmec period. Every Maya inscription that records a king's accession or a military victory draws upon traditions that began in the swamps of Veracruz and Tabasco. Every Aztec calendar stone that depicts the cosmic ages encodes mathematical concepts first developed 3,000 years before the Spanish arrived. The intellectual heritage of the Olmec, like the artistic and religious heritage, flowed forward through all subsequent Mesoamerican history, shaping how millions of people understood their place in the universe. The knowledge systems the Olmec developed served practical as well as spiritual purposes. Agricultural planning required understanding of seasonal cycles, the timing of rains and dry periods that determined when to plant and when to harvest. The flood patterns of the rivers that dominated their landscape followed predictable rhythms tied to broader climatic cycles. Rhythms that careful observation could reveal and calendrical systems could track. The integration of environmental knowledge with astronomical observation created a comprehensive science of timing, a framework for coordinating human activity with natural processes that maximized productivity and minimized risk. Trade networks, too, would have benefited from calendrical coordination. If distant partners shared understanding of temporal cycles, they could synchronize their activities, arranging to meet at specific locations during specific periods for the exchange of goods. The spread of calendrical knowledge beyond the Olmec heartland may have facilitated the expansion of trade, creating shared frameworks that enabled strangers to cooperate effectively. The calendar became not merely a tool for internal organization, but a medium for external communication, a common language of time that transcended linguistic and cultural barriers. The religious dimensions of calendrical knowledge reinforced its social importance. Certain days carried inherent qualities, propitious or dangerous, depending on their position within the ritual cycle. Priests who could interpret these qualities wielded considerable influence, advising rulers and commoners alike on the timing of important actions. The birth date of an individual might determine their destiny, the character traits and life path that the calendar assigned to that particular day. This integration of temporal knowledge with concepts of fate and character gave calendar keepers power over the most intimate aspects of human life. The Cascale block sits now in a museum, protected and studied, its secrets still largely intact, somewhere in the unexcavated portions of Olmec sites. Other texts may wait, additional evidence that could help unlock the code and allow the Olmec to speak to us directly for the first time in 3 millennia. The search continues, driven by the tantalizing possibility that these ancient people had more to say than we have yet been able to hear. The symbols on the stone are a message in a bottle, cast into the sea of time by people who could not know who might eventually find it, or whether anyone would understand. We have found the bottle. The message awaits translation. The jade mask traveled 500 miles from its creation to its final resting place, carried along paths that connected the swamps of the Gulf Coast to the highland valleys of central Mexico. It was not alone in making such journeys across Mesoamerica. In sites separated by mountain ranges and dense forests and territories of peoples who spoke mutually unintelligible languages, objects bearing unmistakably Olmec characteristics have emerged from the earth. These scattered finds trace the outlines of influence networks that extended far beyond the Olmec heartland, connections through which goods and ideas flowed in patterns that shaped the development of civilization throughout the region. The extent of Olmec presence beyond their core territory has fascinated and perplexed scholars since the earliest days of systematic research, and monuments and artifacts displaying Olmec style began appearing at sites hundreds of miles from Veracruz and Tabasco. Researchers faced a fundamental question. Were these objects evidence of Olmec colonies, outposts established by people who had migrated from the Gulf Coast and brought their culture with them? Were they trade goods, prestige items exchanged through networks that moved materials without moving populations, or worthy local productions created by Nanomic peoples who had adopted Olmec artistic conventions and religious symbols as markers of elite status and cosmic power? The answer, as with most complex historical questions, appears to be all of the above in varying proportions depending on time and place. The Olmec influence, visible across Mesoamerica, resulted from multiple mechanisms operating simultaneously, a dynamic process of exchange and emulation that cannot be reduced to any single explanation. Chacotzingo provides perhaps the most dramatic example of Olmec presence in the highlands. This site, located in the modern state of Morelos, roughly 200 miles west of the Olmec Heartland, occupies a valley floor beneath dramatic cliff faces that dominate the surrounding landscape. The cliffs themselves bear carved reliefs in unmistakable Olmec style, images of rulers and supernatural beings that could have been created at Venta or San Lorenzo. The iconography includes the quintessential Olmec motifs of jaguars and feathered serpents, rain imagery, and cosmic symbolism that connect this highland site to the Gulf Coast tradition. The most famous of these reliefs, known as El Rey, or the King, depicts a figure seated within a cave-like opening, surrounded by scrolling clouds, or perhaps vegetation. Above the cave, rain falls in stylized drops, while the overall composition suggests the figure's role as mediator between earthly and supernatural realms. The scene parallels imagery found on Olmec altars in the Heartland, portable stone monuments that show similar figures emerging from niche-like openings. The connection is too specific to be coincidental. Evidence of direct transmission of religious concepts from Gulf Coast to Highland. Itchaquitzingo was not simply an Olmec colony transplanted to a new environment. The local population maintained its own traditions even while adopting Olmec elements, creating a hybrid culture that combined imported and indigenous features. The architecture of the site, the pottery used by its inhabitants, the burial practices that disposed of their dead, all show continuity with highland patterns that predated Olmec contact. The Olmec influence represented an overlay, prestigious veneer adopted by local elites who saw advantage in associating themselves with the powerful Gulf Coast civilization. A similar pattern appears at Teopantequinetlan, a site in the modern state of Guerrero, far to the west of the Olmec Heartland. Here, monumental architecture, incorporating Olmec-style sculpture, demonstrates the reach of Gulf Coast influence into regions previously considered peripheral, too early, Mesoamerican development. The site includes a sunken court lined with carved stone blocks depicting figures with Olmec characteristics, creating a ceremonial space that reproduced elements of Olmec sacred architecture in a new setting. The labor invested in this construction indicates that local populations, whatever their ethnic or linguistic identity, had thoroughly absorbed the importance of Olmec religious symbolism. The mechanisms by which Olmec influence spread remain subjects of ongoing investigation. Trade certainly played a role, and the networks that brought jade and obsidian to the Gulf Coast would have carried Olmec goods and ideas in the opposite direction. Merchants who traveled these routes served as cultural intermediaries, bringing not only materials but also information about the prestigious civilization that produced them. Local elites who acquired Olmec objects gained access to the symbolic vocabulary of Mesoamerica's most advanced society, tools for legitimating their own authority through association with recognized sources of power. Marriage alliances may have supplemented trade as vectors for cultural transmission. The practice of elite intermarriage is documented extensively in later Mesoamerican societies, likely has deep roots in the region's history. Olmec rulers seeking to extend their influence might have offered daughters to highland chiefs, creating kinship connections that bound distant regions to Gulf Coast interests. The brides would have brought with them not only political ties, but also cultural knowledge, familiarity with Olmec ritual practices and artistic traditions that could be transplanted to their new homes. Religious pilgrimage offers another possible explanation for the spread of Olmec elements. If the Gulf Coast centers held sacred significance, recognized beyond their immediate vicinity, peoples from distant regions might have traveled there to participate in rituals or to witness ceremonies that could not be replicated elsewhere. Returning pilgrims would have carried memories and objects back to their communities, seeding Olmec influence in places they never directly controlled. The great Mesoamerican tradition of pilgrimage to sacred sites, documented extensively in later periods, may have originated in Olmec times. Some scholars have proposed more direct forms of Olmec expansion, military conquest, or political domination that imposed Gulf Coast control over distant territories. This interpretation finds support in certain artistic depictions that seem to show Olmec figures in positions of dominance over individuals rendered in different styles, possible representations of conquest or tribute relationships. The model would parallel developments in other early civilizations. The expansion of Egyptian or Mesopotamian states through combination of trade, diplomacy, and force. The evidence, however, does not clearly support a model of Olmec empire. The sites showing Olmec influence are scattered rather than contiguous, separated by regions where such influence appears minimal or absent. A genuine empire would be expected to control continuous territory, extending outward from its core incomprehensible patterns. The distribution of Olmec-influenced sites suggests instead selective connections, relationships with particular locations that offered strategic or symbolic advantages rather than comprehensive territorial control. The concept of an Olmec horizon has emerged to describe this pattern of widespread but discontinuous influence. The term, borrowed from archaeological usage in other contexts, refers to a period during which Olmec-style materials appear across a broad geographic range, marking a shared participation in cultural trends that transcended local boundaries. The horizon does not imply political unity or ethnic homogeneity, but rather a common frame of reference. Shared symbols and practices that allowed communication across linguistic and territorial divisions. Contemporary peoples participated in this Olmec horizon to varying degrees. Zapotecs of Oaxaca, developing their own complex society in the highland valleys to the south, adopted certain Olmec elements while maintaining distinctive local traditions. Their writing system, among the earliest in Mesoamerica, shows connections to Olmec antecedents while developing along its own trajectory. Their ceremonial architecture incorporated Olmec motifs but adapted them to local aesthetic preferences. The relationship was one of selective borrowing rather than wholesale adoption, creative engagement with Olmec civilization that produced something new rather than mere imitation. The peoples of the Valley of Mexico, where Aztec civilization would eventually arise, also participated in Olmec networks during this early period. Sites like Tlatilco have yielded burials containing Olmec-style objects alongside locally produced goods. It's evidence of exchange relationships that brought Gulf Coast prestige items to the Central Highlands. The influence was real but limited, one element among many that shaped the development of these highland communities. The foundations of later Central Mexican civilization owed something to Olmec's contact but cannot be reduced to it. Along the Pacific coast of Chiapas and Guatemala, Olmec influence appears at sites that may have served as way stations along long-distance trade routes. The cacao and tropical products of this region would have attracted Olmec interest, creating incentives for establishing relationships with local populations. The influence visible in these coastal sites may reflect commercial connections more than political or religious ones. Practical arrangements for facilitating the movement of desired goods. The debate over Olmec influence connects to larger questions about how civilizations develop and spread. The mother culture concept, which credits the Olmec with originating elements that later characterized all Mesoamerican societies, has attracted both supporters and critics. Supporters point to the chronological priority of Olmec achievements. The fact that so many distinctive Mesoamerican traits appear first in the Gulf Coast heartland. Critics argued that the model oversimplifies a more complex reality, one in which multiple early cultures contributed to the eventual synthesis that defined Mesoamerican civilization. The truth likely lies between these positions. The Olmec did develop many elements first, and their influence on subsequent cultures was real and substantial. But they did not create everything from nothing, and the peoples who adopted Olmec elements were not passive recipients, but active participants who selected, modified, and recombined what they received. Mesoamerican civilization emerged from dialogue among many peoples over many centuries, a collaborative achievement that no single culture can claim as exclusively its own. The networks established during the Olmec period persisted and evolved long after Olmec centers themselves declined. The trade routes, the pilgrimage traditions, the patterns of elite interaction that connected distant regions continued to function, carrying new goods and new ideas along paths first opened in Olmec times when the Maya began their rise to prominence. They inherited not only specific Olmec cultural elements, but also the infrastructure of connection that made the spread of their own innovations possible. The jade mask that traveled 500 miles was more than an object. It was a message, a tangible link between communities separated by geography, but connected by shared participation in a cultural world that the Olmec had done more than any other people to create. The mask carried meanings that transcended its material form, assertions of status and legitimacy that derived from association with the prestigious civilization of the Gulf Coast. Those who possessed such objects possessed also a claim to the power they represented, a share in the cosmic significance that Olmec artisans had invested in their creations. The question of what the Olmec received in return for the influence they extended outward remains partially unanswered. The goods that flowed toward the Gulf Coast, the jade and obsidian and magnetite and serpentine, are well documented in archaeological contexts. But exchange requires reciprocity, and the Olmec must have offered something that distant peoples valued enough to establish and maintain these long-distance relationships. The perishable nature of likely exports, rubber and cacao, and textiles and featherwork, means that direct evidence has vanished, leaving us to infer from context what we cannot observe directly. Information itself may have been among the most valued Olmec exports. The calendrical knowledge, the astronomical observations, the ritual practices that the Olmec had developed represented intellectual capital of enormous value. Access to this knowledge could transform the capabilities of distant elites, giving them tools for organizing their societies and legitimating their authority that they could not have developed independently in the time available. The spread of Olmec calendrical systems across Mesoamerica suggests that such knowledge transfer did occur, whether through formal instruction, observation during pilgrimages, or the movement of trained specialists from Heartland to periphery. Today, museums around the world display artifacts that trace these ancient networks. Jade and obsidian and ceramic objects found far from their places of origin. Each piece represents a journey, a transaction, a relationship between peoples whose names and languages have been forgotten. The objects endure as witnesses to connections that shaped the ancient American world. Material evidence of an Olmec influence that extended far beyond the swamps and rivers of the Gulf Coast heartland. The mother culture, if we may still use that term, raised children across an entire continent, and those children carried her legacy into futures she could not have imagined. The paths those objects traveled still exist in some form. Routes through mountains and along rivers that humans have used for thousands of years. Modern highways sometimes follow ancient trails, their engineers unknowingly retracing journeys that Olmec traders made 3 millennia ago. The geography that shaped those early networks continues to shape movement through the region. The same mountain passes and river crossings and coastal routes that connected Olmec centers to distant communities, now connecting modern cities and towns. The landscape remembers the paths even when the travelers who first blazed them have been forgotten. And somewhere along those paths, additional evidence of Olmec networks may yet await discovery. The colossal heads were dragged to the edges of the plateau and pushed into ravines, their faces ground away by hands that had once revered them, as the great ceremonial centers fell silent, their plazas empty, their temples abandoned to the encroaching forest. The civilization that had dominated the Gulf Coast lowlands for nearly 1,000 years came to an end, not in a single catastrophic moment, but through a process of decline that unfolded over generations. By 400 BCE, the last great Olmec center at Venta had been ritually terminated, its monuments defaced and buried, its sacred spaces decommissioned according to practices whose meanings we can only dimly perceive. The mother culture had run its course, leaving behind monuments and mysteries in roughly equal measure. The causes of Olmec decline have generated extensive scholarly debate, with theories ranging from environmental catastrophe to internal revolution to external conquest. The truth likely involves multiple factors interacting in complex ways. A convergence of pressures that exceeded the capacity of Olmec institutions to manage. Understanding the end of the Olmec requires examining each of these potential causes, while acknowledging that definitive answers may remain forever beyond our reach. Environmental factors almost certainly played some role. The Gulf Coast lowlands presented constant challenges to human occupation. Challenges that successful adaptation could manage, but never entirely eliminate. The rivers that provided transportation and deposited fertile alluvium also flooded unpredictably, sometimes catastrophically. The climate that supported abundant agriculture also fostered disease, parasites, and pests that took constant tolls on human populations. Any disruption to the delicate balance that Olmec society had achieved with its environment could trigger cascading failures difficult to reverse. Some researchers have proposed that the Olmec exhausted the agricultural potential of their heartland through overexploitation. Continuous cultivation of the same lands, even with the annual replenishment of nutrients through flooding, might eventually have depleted soils beyond recovery. The clearing of forests for agriculture and fuel would have altered local hydrology, potentially changing flooding patterns in ways that disrupted established practices. Population growth, a natural consequence of agricultural success, would have intensified pressure on resources, creating a classic Malthusian trap from which escape proved impossible. The archaeological evidence offers some support for environmental explanations. The transition from San Lorenzo to Venta around 900 BCE coincided with apparent environmental changes in the San Lorenzo region. Shifts in river courses and sedimentation patterns that would have affected agricultural productivity and transportation networks. Similar changes may have contributed to Venta's decline 5 centuries later, though the evidence is less clear. The Olmec heartland was not a stable platform, but a dynamic landscape subject to processes that human activity could influence but not control. Political factors may have been equally important. The Olmec system concentrated power in the hands of rulers whose legitimacy derived from claimed connections to supernatural forces. This arrangement worked as long as rulers could deliver the benefits their subjects expected: favorable weather and abundant harvests and protection from enemies. When circumstances turned unfavorable, when droughts came or floods destroyed crops or enemies threatened, the failure could be attributed to the ruler's loss of supernatural favor. The very ideology that supported Olmec kingship contained the seeds of its potential destruction. The deliberate mutilation of monuments at both San Lorenzo and Venta suggests political upheaval of some kind. The colossal heads, those portraits of rulers whose authority had seemed unassailable, were systematically defaced, their features destroyed in acts that went beyond mere vandalism. This pattern indicates intentional effort to erase the symbols of a particular regime, whether by internal revolutionaries overthrowing an unpopular dynasty, or by external conquerors seeking to eliminate the icons of defeated enemies. The burial of monuments following their destruction may have served to complete the ritual termination, sending the images and the power they represented into the underworld from which they could not return. The possibility of internal revolution deserves serious consideration. Complex societies generate inequalities, concentrations of wealth and power that benefit some at the expense of others. The labor that built the pyramids and carved the colossal heads came from common people whose own lives may have been considerably less comfortable than those of the elites they served. If the burdens of supporting Olmec civilization became too heavy, if the benefits of participation in the system ceased to outweigh the costs, popular resistance might have brought the entire structure down. The monuments of kings make tempting targets for those who feel oppressed by kingly power. External threats may have compounded internal pressures. Olmecs were not alone in Mesoamerica, and the people surrounding them were developing their own capabilities over the centuries of Olmec dominance. The Zapotecs of Oaxaca, the inhabitants of the Valley of Mexico, the various groups of the Pacific coast and the Maya lowlands, all were growing more sophisticated, more organized, more capable of challenging Gulf Coast hegemony. Competition for trade routes, for access to valued resources, for regional influence would have intensified as these peripheral peoples gained strength. The Olmec may simply have been overtaken by rivals who learned from their example and eventually surpassed their teachers. The pattern of Olmec decline differed somewhat between major centers. San Lorenzo's fall around 900 BCE was relatively abrupt, marked by the dramatic destruction and burial of monuments within a compressed time frame. The site continued to be occupied afterward, but at reduced scale and without the monumental construction that had characterized its peak period. Whatever happened at San Lorenzo, it effectively ended the site's role as a primary center of Olmec civilization. Venta's decline unfolded more gradually over the centuries following San Lorenzo's fall. The site reached its peak between 900 and 600 BCE. It's a period during which the Great Pyramid was completed and the most elaborate buried offerings were deposited. After 600 BCE, construction slowed and eventually ceased. The final monuments were erected, the last offerings buried, and then around 400 BCE. The site underwent the same ritual termination that had ended San Lorenzo's sacred function 5 centuries earlier. Monuments were defaced, offerings were sealed beneath final layers of fill, and Venta passed from active ceremonial center to abandoned ruin. The period following classic Olmec civilization is sometimes called the Epi-Olmec or post-Olmec era, a transitional phase during which Olmec traditions persisted in modified forms while new cultural patterns emerged. Sites like Tres Zapotes, which had participated in Olmec networks throughout the classic period, continued to function as regional centers, maintaining some continuity with the past while adapting to changed circumstances. The Epi-Olmec period saw the development of more sophisticated writing systems and calendar notations, intellectual achievements that built upon Olmec foundations while surpassing Olmec accomplishments. The Tuxtla statuette, a small jade figurine discovered in the 19th century, bears one of the longest Epi-Olmec texts known, including a long count date corresponding to 162 CE. This object demonstrates the persistence of Olmec-derived traditions more than 5 centuries after Venta's abandonment, evidence that the cultural patterns established during the classic Olmec period retained vitality long after the civilization that created them had transformed into something new. The Epi-Olmec represents not the death of Olmec culture, but its metamorphosis, its continuation in altered form through peoples and places that carried forward selected elements of the original tradition. The transition from Olmec to Epi-Olmec to the later cultures of the Gulf Coast illustrates a pattern repeated toward Mesoamerican history. Civilizations rise and fall, centers flourish and decline, but cultural traditions persist across these disruptions, carried forward by survivors and successors who select from the past what seems useful for the present. The Maya did not spring fully formed from the jungle, but emerged through gradual development that incorporated Olmec influences among many other sources. The same is true of the Zapotecs, the peoples of Teotihuacan, and eventually the Aztecs. Each built upon foundations laid by predecessors, including foundations the Olmec had established. The deliberate destruction of Olmec monuments raises questions about memory and forgetting in ancient societies. When the colossal heads were defaced and buried, were the destroyers attempting to erase all memory of the rulers they depicted? Or were they performing rituals that they believed would transform rather than eliminate the power those images contained? The burial of monuments, rather than their complete destruction, suggests that something of their significance was being preserved, even as their visible presence was eliminated. The heads were being sent somewhere, consigned to an underworld realm where they might continue to exist in altered form. Later, peoples who lived near the buried monuments developed their own traditions about the stone giants beneath the earth. Folk memories preserved awareness that something significant lay hidden in the landscape, even when specific knowledge of who had created these objects and why had been lost. When archaeologists began excavating Olmec sites in the 20th century, local informants could sometimes guide them to buried monuments, passing along knowledge that had survived across 3,000 years through purely oral transmission. The Olmec were not entirely forgotten, even if what was remembered had been transformed almost beyond recognition. The rivers of the Gulf Coast continued to flow after Olmec civilization ended, carrying sediment and reshaping the landscape as they had done for millennia before the first Olmec settlement was established. The swamps continued to form and drain with seasonal rhythms indifferent to human history. The forest reclaimed the cleared lands, growing over pyramids and plazas until only subtle mounds remained to mark where ceremonial centers had once stood. Nature proved more persistent than culture, outlasting the civilization that had briefly imposed order on a small portion of its domain. But the Olmec legacy persisted in ways that transcended their physical presence in the landscape. The ideas they developed, the artistic traditions they established, the religious concepts they articulated, all flowed forward through time, carried by the peoples who inherited and transformed them. Every Maya temple that rose above the jungle canopy owed something to Olmec precedent. Every Aztec priest who calculated the movements of Venus drew upon knowledge first systematized in Olmec ceremonial centers. The mother culture had perished, but her children survived, and they carried her memory in forms she could not have anticipated. The end of the Olmec was not an ending, but a transformation, a passage from one state of being to another that preserved essential elements while allowing new configurations to emerge. The civilization that had pioneered so many Mesoamerican traditions did not vanish without trace, but dissolved into the broader cultural stream, its contributions becoming so thoroughly integrated into what followed that they ceased to be recognizable as distinctly Olmec. This is perhaps the most complete form of cultural success, influence so pervasive that it becomes invisible, innovations so thoroughly adopted that they seem to have always existed. The Olmec achieved this kind of immortality, though they could not have known it as they watched their monuments fall and their cities empty into the encroaching green silence of the forest. The populations that had sustained Olmec civilization did not disappear when the great centers declined. People continued to live in the Gulf Coast lowlands, farming the same fertile soils and fishing the same abundant waters that had supported their ancestors. Their material culture simplified, their political organization decentralized, their monumental ambitions diminished, but they persisted, adapting to changed circumstances as human communities always do. Some may have migrated to other regions, carrying Olmec traditions to new homes where those traditions would blend with local practices. Others remained, becoming the ancestors of peoples who would inhabit the region when Spanish explorers arrived 2,000 years later. The archaeology of the post-Olmec Gulf Coast remains less thoroughly studied than the classic Olmec period, a gap in knowledge that future research may partially fill. The sites are there, the artifacts await excavation. The story of how Olmec civilization transformed into what followed remains to be fully told. Each season brings new discoveries, new data points that refine or revise existing understanding. The Olmec decline, like the Olmec flourishing that preceded it, continues to reveal itself gradually to those patient enough to search for its traces in the earth. What remains certain is that something remarkable ended around 400 BCE, and something equally remarkable had begun almost 1,000 years earlier. Between those dates, the Olmec created a civilization that would shape the history of an entire region for millennia to come. Their decline diminishes nor their legacy. Okay? All civilizations end, but not all civilizations matter as the Olmec mattered. The mother culture earned her title not through permanence, but through influence. Not through survival, but through the survival of what she created in the minds and hands of all who came after. 3,000 years have passed since the last Olmec ruler gazed out from his ceremonial center across the swamps and forests of his domain. The rivers have shifted their courses countless times, carving new channels and abandoning old ones in the endless reworking of the coastal plain. The forest has grown and been cleared and grown again, its rhythms indifferent to the monuments it buries and reveals. The people who live in the region today speak Spanish and practice Catholicism and participate in a globalized economy that connects their small towns to markets and influences spanning the entire planet. Yet, something of the Olmec persists, woven into the fabric of this landscape and this culture in ways both visible and hidden. The ball game still echoes through Mesoamerica, though its forms have changed and its sacred meanings have largely faded. When Spanish missionaries first encountered the game in the 16th century, they recognized its importance to indigenous peoples, even as they struggled to understand its significance. The rubber balls that bounced through ceremonial courts traced their ancestry to the latex trees of the Gulf Coast lowlands, the same trees that had provided the Olmec with materials for play and ritual 3 millennia earlier. The game survived conquest and conversion, adapting to new circumstances while retaining connections to its ancient origins. Modern ulama, the descendant of the pre-Columbian ball game, still played in parts of Mexico, preserves techniques and traditions that link contemporary players to their Olmec predecessors. The hip strikes and body movements, the rubber balls, and the competitive spirit all carry forward something essential from those first games played in Olmec ceremonial centers. The rules have changed, the religious dimensions have diminished, but the core experience of propelling a rubber ball without using hands connects, present to pass across an unbroken chain of transmission. The feathered serpent continues its journey through Mexican culture. Transformed but recognizable, Quetzalcoatl became one of the most important deities of Aztec religion. God of wind and learning and the morning star. A figure whose mythological complexity reflected centuries of development since its probable origins in Olmec iconography. Spanish missionaries identified Quetzalcoatl with St. Thomas, attempting to incorporate indigenous beliefs into Christian frameworks. And the feathered serpent entered colonial religious art in hybrid forms that blended European and Mesoamerican elements. Today, the image of Quetzalcoatl appears throughout Mexican visual culture. From murals by Diego Rivera to commercial advertising to the popular imagination that sees in the feathered serpent a symbol of indigenous heritage and national identity. The Olmec, who first combined serpent and feather into a single supernatural being, could not have anticipated this long journey through time and transformation, but something of their original vision persists in every contemporary depiction. The dragon they created continues to fly, scales and plumes carrying meanings that have evolved but never entirely broken from their source. The jade that the Olmec prized above all other materials retains its cultural significance in modern Mexico and Central America. Contemporary Maya communities continue to value jade for its beauty and its associations with life, water, and fertility. Meanings that reach back through their own traditions to the Olmec foundations of Mesoamerican jade symbolism. The green stone still represents something precious beyond mere monetary value, a connection to ancestors and to the earth that provides. Archaeological jade, when it surfaces on the antiquities market, commands prices that reflect both aesthetic appreciation and cultural significance. Collectors around the world seek Olmec jade objects, creating economic incentives that unfortunately drive looting of archaeological sites. The destruction of context that renders artifacts scientific orphans, beautiful but mute, cut off from the information that proper excavation would have preserved. The Olmec legacy includes this shadow side. the vulnerability of ancient treasures to modern greed, the ongoing loss of knowledge that accompanies the illegal trade in cultural property. The colossal heads have become icons of Mexican national identity, images that appear on currency, in tourism promotion, and in the cultural imagination of millions who may know little else about the civilization that created them. These faces, carved 3,000 years ago to commemorate rulers whose names we will never know, now represent something larger, an assertion of indigenous achievement that counters narratives of pre-Columbian America as culturally impoverished or historically insignificant. The heads have become arguments, evidence marshaled in ongoing debates about identity, history, and the meaning of the Mexican past. Reproductions of the colossal heads stand in public spaces throughout Mexico and beyond, concrete and fiberglass echoes of the basalt originals that remain protected in museums. Tourists pose for photographs beside these replicas, capturing images that circulate through social media to audiences spanning the globe. The Olmec aesthetic, refined in Gulf Coast workshops 3 millennia ago, now participates in the visual culture of the digital age. Its distinctive features recognizable to viewers who may never visit the museums where the originals reside. Scholarly research on the Olmec continues to generate new discoveries and new interpretations. Each excavation season brings additional data, additional artifacts, additional puzzles to solve. The application of new technologies, from ground-penetrating radar to isotopic analysis to satellite imagery, reveals features invisible to earlier generations of researchers. The Olmec sites that Matthew Stirling explored in the 1930s and 1940s continue to yield secrets when approached with contemporary methods and questions. Recent discoveries have expanded the geographic range of recognized Olmec influence and pushed back the dates of certain developments. The Cascale block's revelation of early Olmec writing in 1999 transformed understanding of intellectual achievements that had previously been attributed to later cultures. Future discoveries may produce similar revisions, overturning current consensus and opening new avenues for investigation. The Olmec story is not finished, and the chapter we currently occupy will eventually give way to others we cannot yet anticipate. The questions that drive Olmec research reflect broader concerns about human society and its possibilities. How do complex civilizations emerge from simpler forms of organization? How conditions favor innovation, and what factors lead to decline? How do ideas and practices spread across cultural boundaries, and how are they transformed in the process? The Olmec provide a case study for these general questions, specific historical example that illuminates dynamics relevant far beyond the Gulf Coast lowlands where their civilization arose. The environmental setting of Olmec civilization carries a particular resonance in an era of climate change and ecological anxiety. The Olmec adapted successfully to a challenging landscape, developing technologies and social arrangements that allowed them to flourish in conditions that might seem to preclude complex society. Their eventual decline may have resulted partly from environmental factors, the exhaustion of resources, or the disruption of ecological relationships that their success depended upon. These patterns offer cautionary lessons for contemporary societies facing their own environmental challenges. Reminders that adaptation is always provisional and that success can generate the conditions for eventual failure. The Olmec achievement in transforming a difficult environment into the cradle of Mesoamerican civilization demonstrates human creativity and resilience. Without metal tools, without wheels, without draft animals, they quarried and transported massive stones, built pyramids, developed writing and mathematics, established trade networks spanning hundreds of miles. They did this through the organized application of human labor and human intelligence, solving problems through persistence and ingenuity rather than technological shortcuts. Their example suggests that the limitations we perceive in our own circumstances may be less absolute than they appear, that creative responses can emerge from constrained conditions. The mystery of the Olmec The vast expanse of what we do not and may never know about them exercises its own fascination. We can look upon the faces of their rulers, but cannot speak their names. We can trace the outlines of their trade networks, but cannot overhear the negotiations that created and maintained them. We can analyze the remains of their offerings, but cannot witness the ceremonies that consecrated them. This incompleteness invites imagination to supplement knowledge, drawing us into engagement with the past that purely factual reconstruction could never achieve. The colossal heads gaze out from museum cases with expressions that seem to hold secrets they will never share. Their heavy-lidded eyes have witnessed 30 centuries of change since the day they were completed and dedicated to purposes we can only guess. The rulers they depict exercised authority over communities that no longer exist, commanded loyalty from subjects who have left no other trace, participated in events that shaped the history of a region, and then passed beyond recovery. They are present and absent simultaneously, vividly real in their material form, yet silent about everything that gave their existence meaning. The night falls over the Gulf Coast lowlands as it has fallen for millions of years, darkness spreading across a landscape that has seen human presence for only the most recent fraction of its existence. Somewhere beneath the soil, additional Olmec monuments lie waiting. Jaguars carved in jade and figures molded in clay. Objects that have not seen light since the hands that made them placed them in the earth as offerings to powers they hoped to please. The swamps hold their secrets. The rivers run on indifferent to questions we ask about those who once lived along their banks. And yet, the Olmec endure, not as a living civilization, but as a presence woven into everything that followed them. The Maya temples that rise above the Piton jungle rest on conceptual foundations the Olmec laid. The Aztec calendar stone that records the cosmic ages encodes mathematical knowledge. The Olmec systematized a feathered serpent that rides through Mexican folk art, began its journey in Olmec ceremonial centers. The ball game, the jade symbolism, the pyramid form, the very idea that civilization was possible in this part of the world, all carried the Olmec signature, the imprint of the mother culture on all her descendants. To fall asleep to this history is to drift into dreams where time loses its linear constraints, where the past flows into the present, and the boundaries between then and now grow permeable. The Olmec wait in that dream time, the first great civilization of a region that would produce many more pioneers who established patterns that would persist for 3,000 years. Their story is not separate from our story, but part of it. It's an early chapter in a narrative that continues to unfold. Its ending not yet written, its meanings still emerging. The rivers flow on toward the sea, carrying sediment and memory in equal measure. The forest breathes its patient breath, indifferent to the civilizations that have risen and fallen beneath its canopy. And somewhere in the darkness, a jaguar coughs its ancient call, the same sound that Olmec priests heard as they prepared rituals whose purposes we can only imagine. The night belongs to the old powers, the forces that were here before humans arrived and will remain after humans depart. But for 1,000 years, in a small corner of this vast and ancient landscape, the Olmec built something that mattered, something that echoes still in the cultures that inherited their legacy. Sleep now, and let the Olmec story accompany you into rest. Let the colossal heads stand guard over your dreaming, their basalt eyes watching through the millennia. Let the jade glow with its green fire in the darkness behind your eyelids. Let the feathered serpent fly through your imagination, carrying you back to a time when the world was younger and a civilization was taking its first steps toward achievements that would shape a continent. To Olmec have waited 3,000 years to share their story. They can wait a little longer while you sleep. Their monuments patient, their mysteries intact, their legacy secure in everything that came after them and everything that is yet to come.